Before we begin, a quick thank you to everyone who suggested this story. You know who you are. Drop your location and the time in the comments, whether you are listening from Miami, from a city you've never told anyone about, or from somewhere in between 3 and 4 in the morning when the quiet gets a little too heavy. We see you, we always do. And if you're new here, welcome to Sleep Theories. Hit subscribe and let the night take you somewhere most people are afraid to go. Tonight we need to start with a particular kind of courage. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that involves a moment of crisis and a decision made under pressure. The quieter kind. The kind that involves sitting with a question that the people around you have decided is not worth asking, and asking it anyway. The kind that involves looking at the world the way it actually appears when you pay close attention, rather than the way you've been told to see it. The kind that Adrian Vega had to develop over the course of a year that cost him sleep and relationships and a comfortable relationship with his own certainty about the nature of things. That is the kind of courage this story is about. Tonight, we are not talking about something that happened a long time ago in a place no one can verify. We are not talking about blurry photographs from the 1960s or radar anomalies dismissed by men who are now dead. We are talking about January 1st, 2024, a shopping mall in downtown Miami. A night that began like every other New Year's celebration in one of the most photographed cities in the Western Hemisphere, and ended with something that the official record still cannot explain in a way that makes sense to anyone who was actually there. This is the story of 8:34 p.m. at Bayside Marketplace, and once you hear it, the explanation you were given is going to feel less like a conclusion and more like the beginning of a much larger question. Act 1. The night everything changed. January 1st, 2024, 8:34 in the evening. Adrian Vega had been driving for 11 hours. That is not a dramatic detail. That is just what rideshare drivers in Miami do on New Year's Day. The city does not sleep. It barely even pauses. The holiday weekend generates a specific kind of economic pressure, the kind that keeps you on the road past the point where your eyes feel right, past the point where music helps, past the point where you stop thinking about where you are and just keep moving, because the app keeps pinging and the tips are better than a regular Tuesday, and the rent is what it is. Adrian was 27 years old. He had grown up in Hialeah, about 8 miles west of downtown. He knew Miami the way only people who work its streets really know it. Not the version sold in travel guides or shown in films, but the version that exists at the level of traffic patterns and blocked intersections and which parking structures close early and which ones stay open all night. He was intimately familiar with Bayside Marketplace. He had dropped off tourists there hundreds of times. He knew where the buses ran. He knew which side of the building the police liked to park on when they were just idling between calls. He knew what normal looked like, which is exactly why, when he turned onto Biscayne Boulevard at 8:34 in the evening, he knew immediately that what he was seeing was not normal. The first thing he noticed was the lights, not the decorative lights strung around the waterfront for the holiday. The lights of police vehicles, red and blue strobes multiplying in the distance the way they only do when something has already escalated well past the point of a single unit response. He counted 4, then 6. Then he stopped counting because they were still coming. The second thing he noticed was the people. Not people walking away from something in the casual way a crowd disperses after a fight or a minor disturbance. People running, not jogging or hurrying or moving with purpose, running, full sprint, women with heels in their hands, men with phones still raised, recording backward over their shoulders at whatever they were running from. Children being carried, strollers abandoned against the low wall near the water. Adrian pulled to the side of Biscayne and put his hazards on. His passenger had already cancelled the ride. He sat and watched. The helicopters came next. 2 of them, then a third circling low over the bay, and the mall complex in overlapping patterns that he would later describe as more organised than anything he had seen during previous police responses in the area. They were not hovering in a single spot the way a helicopter does when it is searching a specific location. They were moving in coordinated arcs, as if maintaining perimeter over a defined zone rather than tracking a single subject. He got out of his car. That decision would change the next year of his life. The first witness account Two teenagers were sitting on the curb about 40 feet from his car. A boy and a girl, both looking like they were maybe 16 or 17. The girl had a cut on her knee from where she had fallen. The boy was still holding his phone, but the screen was dark and he was just staring at it like he had forgotten what it was for. Adrian approached them the way anyone approaches two frightened teenagers in the middle of a crowd, panic. Carefully, hands visible, voice low. He asked if they were hurt. He asked if they needed help. The girl shook her head. The boy looked up at him with an expression that Adrian would later describe not as fear exactly, but as something closer to the specific look a person gets when they have just seen something that their brain has not yet found a category for. He asked them what happened inside. They told him. The girl said the lights had flickered first. Not a power outage, not a complete darkness, but a stuttering, a rhythmic dimming and brightening that moved in a wave from one end of the atrium toward the other, rather than going out uniformly the way a circuit failure would cause. She said it happened twice, maybe 3 times, before anyone started running. The boy said he had been near the escalators on the ground floor. He said the shadows changed. He used that phrase specifically. The shadows changed. And when Adrian asked him to explain what he meant, he said that there were shapes near the base of the escalators that did not correspond to anyone standing there. That the shadows existed without a visible source. That they were tall, much taller than a person. Then he said something that Adrian would replay in his head for weeks. He said very quietly, as if he was still not entirely sure he should be saying it out loud. It was not a person. Not. I did not recognize the person. Not. I could not tell who it was. Not even. It looked strange. The specific phrasing was a negation, a categorical rejection. Whatever he had seen near those escalators, his brain had processed it, evaluated it against every framework he had for identifying a human being, and returned a clean verdict. Not a person. Adrian drove them to a gas station a few blocks away and waited until the girl's mother arrived. He gave them both his number. He drove home. He did not sleep. The police response that did not match the explanation. By the end of that night, the official story was already taking shape. Miami Police Department representatives would eventually describe the incident as a large group disturbance involving teenagers and fireworks. The word fireworks would be used repeatedly in the days that followed, appearing in local news reports with a confidence that seemed to assume no one would look too closely at whether the explanation fit the observable facts. Adrian looked closely. He had a specific advantage that most people analysing the incident from a distance did not have. He had been there. He had seen the response in real time, and what he had seen did not look like the police response to a fight and some illegal fireworks. A fight involving fireworks in a crowded public space is a common occurrence in Miami on New Year's. The standard response involves a handful of units, maybe a paddy wagon if arrests are expected, crowd control at the exit points, and usually a wrap-in under an hour. The responding officers form a loose perimeter, locate the individuals involved, make arrests if necessary, and disperse the crowd. It is a known quantity. There are protocols for it. Those protocols do not require more than 50 patrol vehicles. 50 was the number Adrian arrived at by combining his own direct observation with the videos that flooded social media that night. He was conservative with his count. He was not trying to exaggerate. He included only vehicles he could independently verify through multiple sources, and the number he kept arriving at was somewhere between 50 and 60 police vehicles surrounding a shopping mall because of a fight and some fireworks. The helicopters did not match the explanation either. Aerial surveillance is not a standard component of crowd disturbance response. You do not scramble helicopters over a mall because a group of teenagers got into a fight. You scramble helicopters when you're trying to contain an area, when you need eyes on something that cannot be tracked from street level, or when the nature of the threat is uncertain enough that command needs situational awareness from above. The road closures did not match the explanation. Multiple blocks surrounding Bayside were shut down that night. Not cordoned off in the immediate vicinity of the disturbance, shut down in a wide perimeter that restricted vehicle access from multiple directions simultaneously. That kind of closure requires coordination between multiple units, and is typically reserved for incidents classified as potential active threats, bomb threats, armed standoffs, mass casualty events in progress. The explanation was fireworks and a teenage fight. The response looked like something else entirely. Act 2. What people saw. The social media explosion. By 9 o'clock that night, the story was already spreading faster than any platform algorithm could reasonably manage. TikTok, Instagram and X were filling with posts from people who had been inside the mall, people who had been outside the mall, people who had been watching from hotels across Biscayne Bay, and people who had been scanning police scanners as a hobby on New Year's and had caught the initial dispatch calls. The range of what people claimed to have witnessed was striking, not because it was wildly inconsistent, but because it was not. The consistency was what made it interesting. When hundreds of people independently describe the same specific details without having coordinated their accounts, the consistency becomes difficult to dismiss as collective imagination or social media contagion. Multiple accounts describe the same thing. Large figures. Very large. The estimates range from 8 to 10 feet in height, with several witnesses independently arriving at the upper end of that range. The figures were described uniformly as dark, not wearing dark clothing, not partially obscured by shadow, but dark in their entirety, as if they were made of shadow rather than standing in it. Multiple witnesses described the movement as wrong, in a way they struggled to articulate. Smooth where it should have been jointed. Fluid where a human body would show the mechanical compromise of joints and weight distribution. One woman who had been sitting at a restaurant on the second level described watching a figure move from one side of the atrium to the other and said it was like watching something that had learned to imitate walking but had not quite committed to making it look real. The hashtags multiplied quickly. Miami Mall Creatures, Bayside Incident, Miami Aliens. The volume was significant enough that by midnight, several of the hashtags were trending in South Florida. By the following morning, they had spread nationally, and then, over the course of the next 24 hours, they began to disappear. Not gradually, not organically, the way a story fades when interest moves on. Abruptly. Videos that had accumulated tens of thousands of views overnight went private or were deleted entirely. Accounts that had posted footage deactivated with no explanation. The hashtags that had been trending were suddenly returning minimal results. When users searched for the footage they had seen the night before, they found it replaced almost immediately by debunking articles and news reports, repeating the official fireworks explanation. Adrian noticed all of this. He was not the only one, but he was one of the people paying closest attention. The missing footage. He had been downloading clips since the night of the incident. Not because he had any particular plan at that point. It was instinct more than strategy. The same instinct that makes you screenshot something before it disappears. The low-grade suspicion that something might not be there when you go back to look for it. That instinct proved accurate. By the third day after the incident, he had catalogued over 60 individual video clips sourced from different accounts, different angles, different devices. He laid them out in a timeline, matching timestamps where possible, trying to reconstruct a coherent picture of what had been happening inside and around the mall between 8:30 and midnight. Several patterns emerged that he found difficult to explain. The first was the cut-off phenomenon. Multiple clips from different angles, not the same clip being reshared, but genuinely different recordings from different people standing in different locations, exhibited the same abrupt termination point. The footage would be running, capturing the crowd, capturing the police vehicles, capturing the lights, and then at a specific moment it would simply end. Not a gradual fade or a camera being lowered. A hard cut. The kind of termination that comes from a phone suddenly powering off, or from a file being corrupted at a specific frame. The fact that this was happening across multiple devices, multiple platforms, multiple accounts at a similar timestamp was difficult to attribute to coincidence. The second pattern was the security footage. Bayside Marketplace is a significant commercial property with extensive internal and external surveillance infrastructure. In the aftermath of any major incident at a commercial property, security footage is typically reviewed and, depending on the circumstances, sometimes released publicly or to media outlets, at minimum acknowledged as part of the investigative record. In the weeks and then months following the Bayside incident, no mall security footage was released. No clips, no stills, not a frame. Adrian reached out to a former employee of the mall, someone he found through a mutual contact on a local community forum. That conversation would become one of the more significant threads in his entire investigation. The employee, who asked not to be identified, told him that on the night of January 1st, security staff had been instructed to surrender their digital video recording systems. Not to copy the footage for investigators, not to provide access for review, to surrender the physical hardware, the DVR units themselves, removed from the security office and taken by people the employee described as not local police. People who arrived separately, who were not in Miami Police Department uniforms, who spoke to the mall's general manager and then left quickly with the equipment. The employee did not know who those people were. They were not introduced. They did not present credentials to the security staff. They simply arrived, communicated with management, and left with the recording hardware. The footage from inside the mall on the night of January 1st, 2024 has never been publicly released or publicly acknowledged. Timeline irregularities. The official account described the incident as having been resolved relatively quickly. The Miami Police Department's public statement suggested that the disturbance had been contained, the crowd had been dispersed, and the scene had been cleared in a time frame consistent with a standard crowd disturbance response. The implication was that by late evening things were back to normal. Adrian began collecting scanner recordings. Amateur radio enthusiasts and scanner hobbyists maintain an extensive network of recorded police radio transmissions across South Florida. It is not a secret network. It is a publicly accessible archive of public safety communications that anyone can listen to. Adrian spent several weeks tracking down recordings from the relevant frequencies on the night of January 1st and cross-referencing them against the official timeline. What he found was a discrepancy. The official account suggested resolution within a relatively short window. The scanner recording showed active police communication at Bayside continuing for nearly 4 hours after the incident was supposed to have been resolved. More significantly, the recordings captured radio traffic involving units from outside Miami-Dade County, agencies that would have no standard reason to respond to a teenage disturbance at a shopping mall in downtown Miami. The call volume during that extended period did not sound like a cleanup operation. It sounded like an active scene. Units were being repositioned. Staging areas were being designated. There were references to access points and perimeter integrity that are not part of the standard vocabulary for wrapping up a crowd disturbance. Whatever happened at Bayside on January 1st, 2024, the police radio record suggests it was not fully resolved by the time the official account says it was. Act 3. The Rabbit Hole. The anonymous message. 3 weeks after the incident, Adrian received an email. He had been careful about his online activity in the period following the event. He had not posted publicly under his own name. He had not joined any of the forums or groups that had formed around the incident. He had been observing, collecting, and staying quiet, which made the email unusual, because whoever sent it had somehow connected his identity to his interest in the investigation, despite his efforts to keep that connection invisible. The message was sent through an encrypted email service. The sender's address was a randomized string with no identifying information. The content was brief. The sender claimed to be a dispatcher who had been working the relevant communications channel on the night of January 1st. They said they had something Adrian needed to know. He wrote back. It took 4 days to get a response. When it came, it was longer. The dispatcher, and Adrian had no way to verify this claim, which he was careful to acknowledge in everything he later wrote about it, said that the initial call classification for the Bayside incident had not been crowd disturbance. It had not been fireworks. It had not been any of the standard categories used for public order events. The initial classification had been something the dispatcher referred to as unknown entity/crowd panic. That classification, the sender explained, was not one that dispatchers encountered frequently. It was not a standard category in the Miami Police Department's response taxonomy. It was a designation used in a specific set of circumstances that the dispatcher described as falling outside normal incident parameters. The examples they gave as comparisons were aircraft crashes, mass casualty threats in progress, and, this was the phrase that stopped Adrian cold, hazardous unknowns. Hazardous unknowns. The category exists. It is not a conspiracy theory invention. It is a real designation in emergency communications protocols, used for situations where the nature of the threat has not been identified with enough clarity to apply a standard response category. When dispatchers do not know what they are dealing with, when the reports coming in are too chaotic, too inconsistent with known threat types, too strange to fit existing frameworks. Some jurisdictions use interim classifications that acknowledge the uncertainty rather than forcing a premature categorization. The initial classification on the night of January 1st had been in that family. The dispatcher said the classification was changed later. The records were updated by the time anyone filed a public records request or asked questions through official channels. The incident was categorized as what it eventually appeared in every news report: a large group disturbance involving fireworks and teenagers. Adrian stared at his screen for a long time after reading that. Witness interviews. Over the following months, Adrian systematically tracked down people who had been present at Bayside on the night of January 1st. This was not a simple process. Many people did not want to talk. Some had received social media harassment after posting their original accounts and had gone quiet as a result. Some had been contacted by people they could not clearly identify, not official investigators, not journalists, not anyone they could put a name to, and had been quietly discouraged from discussing the incident further. The ones who did agree to speak with him described experiences that were mutually consistent in ways that would be difficult to achieve through coordination or fabrication. A store employee who had been working a retail location on the ground floor described seeing what she called black silhouettes. She was specific about the distinction she was drawing. She was not describing people wearing dark clothing. She was not describing people standing in unlit areas. She was describing silhouettes that existed in the lit space of the mall's interior, shapes that had the visual properties of shadows, but were occupying three-dimensional space in a way that shadows cannot. She said there were at least two of them. She said they were tall enough that the top of the nearest one extended above the frame of the door she was using as a reference point, which she estimated at approximately 8 feet. She said they were not moving when she first saw them. They were standing, if standing is the right word for a thing that does not have visible legs, in the central atrium near the base of the escalators. Then she closed the gate on her store and hid in the back and did not come out until the police were already inside. A security guard who had been stationed at the waterfront entrance described a different kind of anomaly. His radio had malfunctioned. He was specific about this too. Not static, not an interference pattern he associated with normal radio frequency congestion in a crowded environment. The radio had simply stopped functioning. No signal, no carrier tone, nothing. He had tried switching channels, switching batteries, trying his personal phone. His phone had also lost signal at that point. No bars, no data, no ability to send or receive. He said the signal blackout lasted somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes. When it resolved, both devices came back on as if nothing had happened. A tourist from out of state who had been visiting with his family described the phone signal disruption independently, without having spoken to the security guard, without being aware of his account. He said that inside the mall, his phone had gone completely dark. He had attributed it initially to cell tower congestion. New Year's Day in Miami. Thousands of people trying to call and text simultaneously. That is a reasonable assumption. But he had been outside the mall on the waterfront by the time the police arrived and his phone was still not functioning. He had eventually walked several blocks away, and only then had the signal returned. Multiple witnesses, contacted separately, described the movement of the figures using language that consistently pointed at the same anomaly. The motion did not involve the visible mechanical compromise that human walking involves. There was no counterbalancing of the upper body. There was no shifting of weight from foot to foot. There was no head bob, no arm swing, none of the small involuntary adjustments that a human body makes in the process of bipedal locomotion. The figures moved through space the way a projection moves, tracking steadily without the inherent instability of a body that is constantly catching itself from falling. One witness said, "It moved like it was being dragged." Another said, "It moved like it was on rails." A third said, and this was the phrase that Adrian could not stop thinking about, "It moved like it did not have weight." Federal presence. Among the photographs and videos Adrian had collected from the night of the incident, a subset captured the vehicles surrounding Bayside in enough detail to allow for partial license plate identification. He was methodical about this. He did not take shortcuts. He cross-referenced what he could access through public record searches, vehicle registration databases accessible to the general public, and the work of several people in the online investigation community who had expertise in vehicle identification. What emerged from that process was a profile of the responding vehicles that included elements inconsistent with a standard local police response. Among the units photographed outside Bayside on the night of January 1st were vehicles that analysts identified as consistent with Department of Homeland Security liaison configurations. These are not marked vehicles. They do not say Department of Homeland Security on the side, but they have recognisable characteristics, antenna configurations, specific vehicle models favoured for that type of deployment, plate sequences that can sometimes be traced through public records. The identification was not certain. It was consistent. There were also communications vans, multiple of them, large vehicles with roof-mounted antenna arrays that do not belong to the Miami Police Department's known fleet. Communications vans of that type are used for large-scale incident coordination, when the standard radio infrastructure needs to be supplemented, or when secure communications separate from the local network are required. You do not deploy communications vans to a fight involving teenagers and fireworks. No federal involvement in the Bayside incident has ever been publicly acknowledged. When local media asked the Miami Police Department about federal agency coordination in the days following the incident, the department's response was that the incident had been handled by local law enforcement and no federal assistance had been requested or provided. Adrian had photographs that raised serious questions about that statement. Act 4. Digital erasure. The algorithm. By February of 2024, the online landscape around the Bayside incident had been transformed in a way that Adrian found more unsettling than the incident itself. He had a friend, a software developer with specific professional expertise in content distribution analytics and platform behaviour, who agreed to help him analyse what had happened to the coverage. They spent several evenings working through the data together, pulling metadata from cached pages, tracking engagement histories on archived versions of posts, comparing search result rankings at different points in time. What the developer found was not entirely surprising to anyone familiar with how content moderation works on major platforms, but it was striking in its specificity and its timing. Content related to the Bayside incident, videos, posts, written accounts, had experienced what the developer described as an artificial reduction in visibility. Not removal, in most cases. The content had not been taken down. It had been deprioritized. In the recommendation algorithms that govern what content gets surfaced to users, in the search rankings that determine what appears first, when someone types in a query, the Bayside material had been systematically pushed down, replaced with higher-ranked content that presented the official explanation, debunking articles, and mockery. The timing of this deprioritization was the critical detail. It had begun by the developer's analysis within hours of the original uploads, not after a review period, not after human moderation had assessed the content, within hours, which implied either an unusually rapid manual intervention or an automated system that had flagged and acted on this specific content before human reviewers would have had time to process it. There is a known phenomenon in content moderation called coordinated inauthentic behavior flagging, where automated systems identify content clusters being promoted by coordinated networks and reduce their visibility. But that designation typically applies to content being actively amplified by bots or organised campaigns. The Bayside footage was being organically shared by real people who had genuinely been there. It was not a coordinated campaign. It was witnesses uploading their personal experience. The effect on the information environment was significant. By the time most people outside South Florida heard about the Bayside incident, the dominant narrative was already set. The fireworks explanation had been repeated enough times in enough authoritative-sounding outlets that the window for public skepticism had effectively closed. Anyone who searched for more information found the debunking articles first. The witness accounts buried several pages deep in results if they were findable at all. The information landscape had been managed. Whether that management was the result of platform policies, external pressure, or something more deliberate was a question Adrian could not definitively answer. But the effect was real, and it was measurable. The FOIA request. In March of 2024, Adrian submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Miami Police Department seeking bodycam footage from the officers who had responded to Bayside on January 1st. Surveillance footage from the mall's security system, if it had been obtained by the department, and communications logs from the responding units during the period, from 8 p.m. to midnight. He received a response approximately 6 weeks later. The response informed him that bodycam footage from the relevant officers was not available. The reason given was that the officers had not activated their bodycams during the initial response phase, which falls within department policy regarding discretionary activation in crowd management contexts. The surveillance footage, if it had been obtained by the department, was exempt from release under an exemption cited for active investigative materials. The communications logs were available in a heavily redacted form. What Adrian received was a document in which significant portions of the radio traffic records had been blacked out, leaving only fragments of the timeline and almost none of the substantive communication content. The reason cited for the redactions was, and this phrase gave him genuine pause, active investigative sensitivity. The incident had been officially closed. The public record had been officially closed. The Miami Police Department's own press communications had described the incident as resolved. There were no pending charges, no ongoing prosecution, no stated investigative thread that would require the suppression of public records under any standard exemption. But the records were being withheld because of active investigative sensitivity. Active investigations and closed cases are mutually exclusive categories. You cannot simultaneously close an incident and maintain it as an active investigation, unless the investigation that is keeping those records sensitive is not the one that was publicly closed, unless something else is being investigated, something that the official closure of the disturbance report was not intended to conclude. Adrian filed a second request. The response was similar. He filed an appeal. The appeal was denied without substantive explanation. Act 5. A pattern. Similar incidents. One of the disciplines that serious researchers in the anomalous phenomena space have developed over the past 2 decades is pattern recognition across incident reports. Not the pattern recognition of paranoid conspiracy thinking, where disparate events are forced into a framework by someone determined to see connections. The disciplined, methodical kind that asks, when you remove the emotional overlay, when you strip away the dramatic interpretation, what are the structural similarities between these events at the level of verifiable fact? Adrian spent months applying that discipline to the Bayside incident, and what he found was not reassuring. In April of 2023, residents of a neighbourhood in Las Vegas began reporting something in the backyard of a property on Doral Lane. The initial call to police described the experience as witnessing something crash from the sky and observing non-human entities near the landing site. Body camera footage released as a result of that case showed responding officers visibly unsettled in a way inconsistent with responding to a false report. One officer, widely quoted in subsequent coverage, was captured on camera saying that his whole body was shaking. Another officer's footage showed him pointing his camera at an empty space behind a forklift and saying that he could see something there, something he described as approximately 8 to 10 feet tall with a very large stature. The Las Vegas case received initial coverage that treated it seriously, then a wave of debunking content, then relative silence. No federal investigation was publicly announced. No analysis of the alleged landing site was officially released. The incident joined a growing archive of events that had been loud enough to generate coverage and then quiet enough to be effectively forgotten. Mall evacuations classified as disturbances had occurred in multiple cities in the preceding years, several of which showed structural similarities to the Bayside incident. Large police response out of proportion to the stated cause, rapid online narrative management, witness accounts that diverge significantly from official explanations, specific descriptions of large, non-human appearing entities in public commercial spaces. Each of these incidents had followed the same arc: initial chaos, significant witness testimony, official explanation, debunking cycle, disappearance from public attention. The consistency of that pattern was not by itself proof of anything coordinated. Patterns can emerge from independent actors responding to similar situations in similar ways. But the speed, the uniformity, and the specific tools being employed, social media suppression, rapid media redirection, official closure without substantive investigation, suggested a level of coordination that was difficult to attribute to coincidence. The insider meeting. 7 months after the Bayside incident, Adrian was contacted through a secure channel he had, set up specifically for the investigation. The person on the other end described themselves as a former private security contractor with previous employment in what they called sensitive site management, a term used in certain government and defence contexts to describe the securing and management of locations that have experienced anomalous or sensitive events. They agreed to meet in person. They chose the location. They chose the time. They did not provide their real name, and Adrian did not ask for it. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Adrian came with questions. The contractor came with information that they seemed to have been carrying for a long time. The kind of information that weighs differently once it has been spoken aloud. The contractor described a framework that they said had been in operation for at least the past decade, possibly longer. Urban locations with high population density, shopping centres, transit hubs, sports venues, public squares, were being monitored as what the contractor called high-density observation zones. The monitoring was not primarily for criminal activity or public safety in the conventional sense. It was for anomalous occurrences. Specifically, occurrences involving entities or phenomena that did not fit standard threat categories. The theory the contractor described, and they were careful to frame it as a theory, not confirmed knowledge, was that whatever these things are, they appear in crowded environments deliberately, not accidentally, not because they are drawn to heat or noise or any physical property of populated spaces, but because populated environments provide cover for dismissal. When something impossible happens in front of thousands of people in a chaotic public setting, the chaos itself becomes the explanation. The crowd panic explains the crowd panic. The confusion explains the confusion. By the time anyone begins to compare accounts seriously, the narrative has already been seeded with enough noise to prevent any coherent signal from emerging. The contractor said, "They are not appearing in Times Square because they made a mistake. They are appearing in Times Square because they know what Times Square does to any account of what happened there." Adrian drove home that night thinking about the teenagers on the curb, about the girl's cut knee, about the boy's dark phone screen, about the way he had said it was not a person with the calm certainty of someone who had processed what they saw and arrived at the only honest conclusion available to them. Act 6. The cover-up theory. The government hypothesis. By the summer of 2024, Adrian had been working on this for 6 months. He had more material than he could reasonably process. Witness accounts, scanner recordings, vehicle identification photographs, communications with anonymous sources, FOIA responses, platform analytics data, comparison incident files. He had shared none of it publicly. He was not ready. He was still trying to understand what he was actually looking at. The framework he eventually arrived at was not the framework he had expected when he started. When most people imagine a government cover-up of non-human contact, they imagine the Roswell model. A crash, a recovery, bodies in a hangar somewhere, scientists with security clearances working in secret facilities, reverse engineering technology from another world. The dramatic, contained, singular event that the government knows about and the public does not. That model requires something unusual to have happened once, or a small number of times. It requires the event to be discreet enough to be managed by a defined group of people with defined responsibilities. It requires, at its core, the idea that if you found the right person and asked the right question, you would get an answer that resolved everything. What Adrian was looking at did not fit that model. What he was looking at fit a different and considerably more unsettling model. The idea that these events are not rare, that they are ongoing, that they are occurring with enough regularity that the institutional response to them has become proceduralized, that there are protocols, that those protocols have been refined through repetition, that the people implementing them are not doing so in response to a singular crisis. They are doing so as a matter of standard operating procedure, because this is just something that happens now, and has been happening for long enough that the response has become routine. In that model, the government is not hiding the fact that contact happened. The government is managing the ongoing reality of contact happening, repeatedly, in public, in front of thousands of people, and finding, perhaps with some relief, that the combination of official explanation, social media suppression, and internet ridicule is sufficient to prevent any coherent public response from forming. The objective under this model is not concealment. Full concealment of something that happens in front of thousands of people in shopping malls is not achievable. The objective is narrative management. Keep the signal-to-noise ratio low enough that the signal never coheres into something that demands a response. Let people argue about whether it was real. Let the debunkers do the work of muddying the water. Let the conspiracy theorists take over the conversation in ways that make the serious accounts look ridiculous by association. And above all, do not confirm, do not deny, do not acknowledge. Let the question eat itself. The protocol Adrian reconstructed from his research involved multiple coordinated components. The physical response, overwhelming police presence, served the dual purpose of managing the crowd and controlling visual access to the scene. The digital response, content suppression, and narrative seeding managed the information environment in the hours and days immediately following the incident. The administrative response, FOIA exemptions, record redaction, official closure, sealed the formal record against scrutiny. And the cultural response, mockery, debunking, ridicule, made serious engagement with the question socially costly for anyone who tried. It was not a perfect system. Nothing involving thousands of witnesses, multiple recording devices, and the open internet is ever a perfect system. But it was effective enough. It had been effective enough for years, maybe longer. The bodycam leak. In September of 2024, 8 months after the Bayside incident, an anonymous upload appeared on a file-sharing platform. The file was a short video clip, approximately 40 seconds long, shot in low light with what appeared to be a chest-mounted camera, the form factor consistent with law enforcement bodycam footage. The clip showed a group of officers standing in what appeared to be a commercial, interior corridor. The lighting was poor. The hallway was dark beyond the range of the bodycam's light source. The officers were positioned in a line facing down the corridor, and they were not moving forward. They were moving backward, slowly, in a coordinated way that suggested they were maintaining visual contact with something ahead of them, while putting distance between themselves and it. The audio was partially audible. There was radio chatter, distorted and difficult to pass. There was the sound of footsteps on hard flooring, and there was a voice, clear enough to understand, saying words that Adrian listened to approximately 40 times before he was confident he had transcribed them correctly. That is not a person. The exact phrase. The same phrase the teenage boy had used on the curb outside Bayside on the night of January 1st. Not a variant, not a paraphrase. The same negation, the same categorical rejection, coming from what appeared to be a law enforcement officer looking at something in a dark corridor in a building that matched the interior architecture of Bayside Marketplace. The video was removed from the platform within 4 hours of being uploaded. Adrian had downloaded it before it disappeared. He shared it with several people he trusted to analyse it carefully. None of them could identify clear evidence of fabrication. None of them could definitively confirm it was real. The consensus, for whatever that is worth, was that the footage was consistent with genuine bodycam footage in terms of camera movement, light behaviour, and audio characteristics, and that if it was fabricated with a level of technical sophistication that implied significant resources and motivation. Act 7. The final discovery. Power grid data. In the fall of 2024, Adrian obtained something he had been trying to get for months: electrical grid anomaly logs from the Florida Power and Light service area covering downtown Miami on the night of January 1st. This was not simple to acquire. The data is not public by default. It required connections, patience, and a degree of creative legal navigation that Adrian was deliberately vague about when discussing it. But he obtained it, and what it showed was specific enough to be meaningful. At 8:36 p.m. on January 1st, 2024, there had been a short localized power fluctuation registered at the grid node serving the Bayside Marketplace area. Not a full outage, a fluctuation, a brief anomalous deviation in the electrical load measurement that lasted approximately 4 seconds before stabilizing. 4 seconds is short enough that most people would not notice it even if they were watching a light bulb, but it is long enough to be registered in the grid monitoring system as an anomaly warranting a log entry. What made this interesting to Adrian was not the fluctuation itself. Small fluctuations happen for all kinds of mundane reasons: lightning, equipment malfunction, demand spikes. What made it interesting was the electromagnetic profile of the event as described in the technical log entry. The log recorded what engineers call a transient spike, a sharp, brief surge in electromagnetic activity preceding the fluctuation. Transient spikes of that profile are not typically associated with standard electrical equipment failures. They are more commonly associated with events that generate strong, abrupt electromagnetic fields. Researchers studying unidentified aerial phenomena have documented a consistent pattern over several decades. In cases where witnesses report close observation of unidentified objects or entities, electrical and electronic malfunctions are frequently reported simultaneously. Phones lose signal, radios stop working, vehicles experience transient electronic failures, and in some documented cases electrical grid monitoring systems have recorded anomalous transient spikes in the areas of reported sightings at the times of the reported events. The spike at Bayside at 8:36 p.m. was 2 minutes after Adrian's own timestamp for when he first observed the police vehicles arriving. It was consistent with the window during which witnesses described the lighting inside the mall flickering, the radios failing, and the phones losing signal. It did not prove anything. Adrian was careful about that. It was a data point, not a conclusion. But it was a data point that fit with uncomfortable precision into a pattern that serious researchers had been documenting for years. Return to Bayside. He went back in the spring, months after the investigation had consumed more of his life than he had ever expected it to. He went on a Saturday afternoon when the mall was busy with tourists and families, when the waterfront restaurants were full, and the boats were out on the bay, and the whole scene was the version of Miami that ends up in postcards. He stood in the atrium. He looked at the escalators. He watched the light come in through the glass ceiling and scatter across the tiled floor. He watched the people moving through the space, buying things, eating things, taking photographs of the water. Normal. Completely, entirely, mundanely normal. And then he noticed the security presence. It was subtle. If you were not looking for it, if you had not spent months thinking about what had happened here, you would not register it as anything unusual. A few more uniformed guards than a mall of this size typically maintains. A small, unmarked booth near the waterfront entrance that had not been there before, occupied by a man in civilian clothes who was watching the crowd, with a stillness and a quality of attention that did not match the effect of a standard security employee. Cameras in locations where cameras had not been before. The official story said the incident had been resolved. The official story said it had been a disturbance involving teenagers and fireworks, thoroughly handled and put to rest by the Miami Police Department. But someone apparently was still watching this place, still paying a quality of attention to it that is not typically extended to locations where nothing unusual happened. Adrian walked around the mall for an hour. He bought a coffee. He sat near the water and watched the boats. He felt for the first time in months the specific kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear but from the acceptance of uncertainty. The recognition that you're not going to get a clean answer, that the question is not going to resolve into something satisfying, and that this is itself a kind of information. He went home. He looked at the footage again. The final frame. He had hundreds of hours of video at this point. Most of it he had watched multiple times. Some of it he had watched dozens of times, frame by frame, looking for anything he might have missed. He had not, until that night, paid close attention to his own dashcam footage from January 1st. He had it. He had been running the dashcam all day. It was standard practice for him as a rideshare driver, partly for insurance purposes, partly out of habit. When he had pulled over on Biscayne Boulevard and watched the crowd running out of the mall, the dashcam had been running. He had watched this footage a few times in the weeks after the incident, looking for useful information, and had not found anything particularly notable. The camera angle was wrong. The resolution was not high enough to pick up detail at distance. The scene was chaotic enough that it was hard to isolate anything specific. On that night in the fall, almost a year after the incident, he ran it through a video processing application that a contact had recommended, one that used frame interpolation and contrast enhancement to pull detail out of low-quality footage. He ran it on the segment from 8:32 to 8:46 p.m. 14 minutes of dashcam footage from a car parked on a major street while a crowd of hundreds of people ran past. He watched it at normal speed first, then at half speed, then frame by frame, starting from the moment when the density of running people was highest, working his way through those seconds carefully. At approximately 8:38 p.m, in the background of the frame behind the running crowd, there was a glass storefront on the far side of the pedestrian walkway. The glass was reflective enough to show the scene behind the camera, the street, the cars, the lights, a mirror surface in the middle of a chaotic scene. In that reflection, standing motionless while the crowd ran past it, was a shape, tall, very tall, dark against the lit background, standing at the edge of the walkway with what appeared to be a stillness that the entire surrounding scene, every single human in the frame, did not share, not running, not moving at all, just standing there, watching, not chasing, not pursuing, not participating in any way in the chaos around it, watching the people run, watching the crowd empty out of Bayside Marketplace on the night of January 1st, 2024, with the patient, unhurried quality of something that has nowhere else to be. Adrian stared at that frame for a long time. He saved it. He shared it with his contact list. He sat back in his chair and thought about what the contractor had told him months earlier. They appear in crowded environments because crowded environments provide cover for dismissal. Not because they made a mistake, the contractor had said, but because they know what a crowd does to any account of what happened there. Epilogue: The Upload and the Silence. Adrian published his investigation in October of 2024, not on a major platform, not through any media outlet, not with any institutional support. He posted it himself across the platforms he had been quietly building over the months of his research, a long-form document, the full archive of materials, the witness accounts with identifying details removed, the FOIA responses, the grid anomaly data, the dashcam frame. The response was what he'd expected mostly. A subset of people who had already been following the Bayside story, who had been maintaining their own archives and their own investigations, welcomed the material and began integrating it into their own work. A larger subset of people dismissed it entirely. Hoax accusations, mental health insinuations, the standard apparatus of internet ridicule applied with efficiency and conviction. A third group sat somewhere in the middle, people who found the material credible enough to take seriously but not quite sure what to do with that assessment. Official response: silence. Not a denial, not a debunking statement from the Miami Police Department, not a comment from Bayside Marketplace's management, not an acknowledgement from any federal agency. Silence. The particular silence that is louder than a response that says, "We have decided that the most effective answer to this question is no answer at all." Adrian continued driving rideshare. He kept his dashcam running. He kept his eyes on the city, on the crowds, on the waterfront, on the places where the lights flicker and the shadows change and the phones suddenly stop working. He had asked, in the months of his investigation, whether something had appeared at Bayside Marketplace on the night of January 1st, 2024. He had found enough evidence to form a view on that question, a view he was comfortable defending. But somewhere in the process, the question had shifted beneath him, the way the ground shifts before you realise it is moving. And the question he found himself sitting with now was not the first question. It was the second, the one that mattered more, not whether something had appeared, but why the people responsible for the official response had known exactly what to do when it did. Not improvised, not panicked, not confused, prepared, with protocols, with vehicles, with communications infrastructure, with a narrative ready, with procedures for clearing the scene and managing the footage and redacting the records and guiding the story toward a conclusion that kept the public calm and incurious. That level of preparation does not come from responding to a singular, unprecedented event. That level of preparation comes from practice, and if there has been enough practice to produce that kind of preparation, then the question is not about January 1st, 2024. The question is about everything that came before it, every incident that produced a protocol, every event that trained a response, every night in every city where the shadows changed and the phones stopped working and the people ran and the lights came and the story was managed and the records were sealed and the world went back to normal, because normal is the version of the world we have agreed to maintain. The question is how long this has been going on, and who decided somewhere at the beginning of it that you were better off not knowing. What we choose to see. There is a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that comes with living in proximity to something you cannot explain. The human brain is extraordinarily good at protecting itself from information that does not fit its working model of reality. Psychologists call it motivated reasoning. Philosophers call it epistemic closure. Regular people call it not wanting to think about it. The mechanism is the same regardless of what you call it. The mind encounters evidence that would require a fundamental revision of its assumptions, assesses the cost of that revision, decides the cost is too high, and reclassifies the evidence as unreliable. This is not stupidity, it is not weakness. It is a survival mechanism that has served our species well across most of its history, because the alternative, treating every anomalous experience as an invitation to rebuild your entire model of reality from scratch, would be functionally paralysing. You cannot live a normal life if you're constantly processing everything from first principles. You need shortcuts. You need categories. You need the ability to see something strange and say that is probably nothing and keep moving. The problem is that this mechanism can be exploited. If you understand how it works, if you understand that most people will default to the existing explanation when one is provided, that the threshold for doubting an official account is higher than the threshold for accepting one, that the social cost of being seen to take anomalous claims seriously is sufficient deterrent for most people, then you have a framework for managing information. You know that you do not need to convince everyone. You only need to provide a sufficiently plausible alternative explanation and let the human tendency toward normalcy do the rest. The fireworks explanation for what happened at Bayside on January 1st, 2024 was not a good explanation. It did not fit the scale of the police response. It did not fit the testimony of dozens of independent witnesses. It did not fit the electromagnetic data from the power grid. It did not fit the behaviour of the responding officers as described by those who observed them. It did not fit the FOIA redactions or the missing surveillance footage or the federal vehicles that had no business being a teenage disturbance. But it was an explanation. It was a category. It was a box, however poorly constructed, into which the available evidence could be roughly pushed with enough force. And once an explanation exists, the burden of proof shifts to those who challenge it. You're no longer trying to establish what happened. You are trying to unseat something that has already been planted in the information environment as the official account. And unseating an official account, even a transparently inadequate one, requires a level of collective sustained attention that the modern information environment is specifically designed to prevent. There is always another story. There is always another clip. There is always another hashtag trending, another crisis emerging, another piece of content demanding your finite daily allocation of attention. The Bayside incident competes with everything else in the feed, and everything else in the feed, in aggregate, always wins. This may not be accidental. The geomagnetic question. In the months after the Bayside incident, Adrian was contacted by several researchers with backgrounds in physics, electromagnetic theory, and what is sometimes called UAP-adjacent science, a loose community of people who bring genuine technical expertise to the study of unidentified phenomena. One of them raised a question that Adrian had not considered. Why Miami? If these events are happening in crowded urban environments with some regularity, why are certain cities and certain locations recurring in the witness record more frequently than others? Why does South Florida appear in incident reports disproportionately to its size? Why does the Bayside waterfront specifically show up in multiple separate witness accounts from different years, not just January 1st, 2024? The researchers' answer involved geomagnetics. The Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It varies in intensity and direction across the surface in ways that have been extensively mapped and studied. Certain locations sit above geological formations that create local magnetic anomalies, deviations from the expected baseline field strength and orientation. South Florida sits above a complex geological substrate that includes significant carbonate rock formations and proximity to the Atlantic Ocean's highly magnetic seafloor. The Miami area registers geomagnetic measurements that differ meaningfully from the surrounding region's baseline. The significance of this, if you accept the electromagnetic anomaly data associated with reported non-human entity sightings, is worth considering. If these phenomena are in some way related to electromagnetic field conditions, if they appear preferentially in areas where the magnetic environment differs from the norm, then locations like Miami are not random choices. They are locations where the conditions that may facilitate these appearances are more commonly present. The power grids spike at 8:36 p.m. on January 1st fit within the electromagnetic profile that researchers have associated with these events. The phone signal failures fit. The radio malfunctions fit. The specific section of downtown Miami where Bayside sits, against the bay above the geology of South Florida, fits. Adrian was careful not to overweight this. He was careful, throughout his investigation, about the distinction between evidence that is consistent with a hypothesis and evidence that proves it. But consistency, when it accumulates across enough independent data points, becomes its own kind of argument. The question of disclosure, 2023 and 2024, were not ordinary years in the history of official engagement with the non-human intelligence question. In July of 2023, a former intelligence official named David Grush testified before the United States Congress. He testified, under oath, that the United States government had for decades been in possession of non-human craft and non-human biological material. He testified that this program had been hidden from congressional oversight and operated through a network of private contractors to avoid the scrutiny applied to publicly acknowledged government programs. He testified that individuals who had attempted to report on this program through official whistleblower channels had faced retaliation. This was not a minor event. A decorated intelligence official testifying under oath before Congress, making specific claims about the existence of a classified non-human recovery program. In any other era of American political life, the claim would have been the defining news story of the year. It received coverage, and then the coverage moved on, and then the next story arrived, and the next, and the Grush testimony joined the growing archive of events that had been loud enough to generate attention, and then quiet enough to be absorbed into the general background noise of American political chaos. But the official environment had shifted, even if the public environment had not fully tracked the shift. In the years surrounding the Bayside incident, the US government had acknowledged the existence of a program to study unidentified aerial phenomena, had released previously classified footage showing military encounters with objects that performed maneuvers inconsistent with known aerospace technology. had convened multiple congressional hearings at which officials described the UAP question as a genuine national security concern, had, for the first time in decades, created the institutional architecture for treating these phenomena as real, rather than dismissing them. This context matters for understanding the Bayside response. If the government was, by January of 2024, in the process of developing an official acknowledgement posture around the UAP question, then the management of the Bayside incident reflected something specific, a decision that whatever happened at that mall was not part of the disclosure framework, that it would be handled through the existing suppression protocols rather than through the emerging transparency architecture, that this particular event with these particular characteristics in this particular location was not the one that got to be part of the official story. Why not? What makes one incident part of the narrative that is being gradually disclosed, and another incident something that gets buried under fireworks and teenagers? What determines which events get absorbed into the official acknowledgement process, and which events get redacted files and withdrawn DVR systems and silent FOIA responses? Adrian did not have a complete answer to that question. But he had a theory. He thought the distinction might be related to what was seen, that some phenomena are being prepared for public disclosure. The craft, the lights, the aerial anomalies that can be framed as a technology question and managed within a national security and aerospace context. And that other phenomena, the ones that do not fit that framing, the ones that appeared in a shopping mall atrium and moved through a lit space without casting shadows and stood 8 feet tall, watching people run, are on a different list. The list that does not get to be part of the disclosure. The list that stays buried. The culture of ridicule. There is a specific tool in the management of anomalous information that Adrian came to understand more clearly through his months of research. It is not surveillance. It is not censorship in the traditional sense. It is something more elegant and considerably more durable. It is the weaponization of embarrassment. Human beings are social animals. We calibrate our expressed beliefs in part based on what our social environment will accept. We are capable of private belief in things we would never voice publicly, because the social cost of voicing them is too high. We monitor the reactions of our peers. We absorb the signals about which beliefs are acceptable, and which beliefs will result in mockery, ostracism, loss of social standing, professional consequences, and we adjust accordingly. The UFO subject, the broader category within which Bayside and Las Vegas and the congressional testimony and every other anomalous incident exists, has been managed through this mechanism for decades more successfully than it has been managed through any classification system or surveillance program. The classification systems leak, witnesses talk, documents get released under FOIA, whistleblowers come forward. The material evidence is always at risk of surfacing, but the culture of ridicule is self-sustaining. It requires no maintenance. Once established, it perpetuates itself through the normal social dynamics of human groups. People mock UFO believers not because they have evaluated the evidence and found it insufficient. They mock them because mocking them is the socially validated response, because the category has been successfully associated with credulity and instability, and the particular kind of intellectual embarrassment that people are most motivated to avoid. The ridicule has been made contagious. Researchers studying the management of anomalous information have traced this cultural architecture back to a specific period in the late 1940s and 1950s, when American intelligence agencies were actively working to prevent public panic about aerial phenomena by seeding media coverage with dismissive framing. The tools were different then. There was no internet. There was no algorithmic content management. But the underlying strategy, not censorship but stigma, was the same strategy that is being applied today with considerably more sophisticated tools. By the time the TikTok videos from Bayside were being buried in search results, the cultural architecture that made that burial effective had been under construction for the better part of a century. The algorithms were the new version of an old mechanism. The ridicule was the same ridicule. The outcome, a public that has access to the evidence and chooses not to take it seriously for social rather than epistemic reasons, was exactly what the original architects of that strategy had designed for. Adrian thought about this often. He thought about the teenagers on the curb, He thought about the girl's cut knee, the boy's dark phone. He thought about how they had seen something and said what they saw with the directness that belongs to people who have not yet fully internalized the social cost of saying certain things out loud. He thought about what happens to that directness over the years, how it gets trained away, how you learn to second guess what you saw because of what saying it will cost you. He thought about what it means that the most honest witnesses are always the ones with the least to lose from honesty. The weight of the record. By the time Adrian compiled everything he had gathered, the witness accounts, the scanner data, the FOIA responses, the vehicle photographs, the grid anomaly logs, the platform analytics, the communications from the anonymous dispatcher, the notes from his meeting with the contractor, the dashcam footage and the frame that sat at the centre of everything, the archive occupied more than 40 gigabytes of storage. 40 gigabytes is a mundane number in the context of digital media. It is the size of a handful of movies, a moderately large music collection, a few years of photographs. But as a record of a single night at a shopping mall in Miami, it represents something significant. It represents the aggregate of dozens of individual people's genuine experience, imperfectly captured, partially suppressed, but still extant, still present, still resisting the complete erasure that had been attempted. The archive existed because of a specific combination of factors that may not always be available. It existed because digital recording technology is now cheap and ubiquitous enough that suppression cannot be total. It existed because there are communities of people who save things before they disappear, who understand that the window between upload and deletion is the critical window, who treat the preservation of primary sources as a form of public service. It existed because Adrian happened to be at the right place, with the right combination of curiosity and stubbornness, and willingness to spend a year of his life on a question that most people around him thought was at best eccentric, and at worst, a sign of something worrying. The archive is incomplete. It is imperfect. It does not constitute proof in any courtroom sense of that word, but it constitutes something. It constitutes the kind of accumulated, cross-referenced, multi-source documentary record that is the difference between a story that can be told and a story that cannot. And the fact that it exists despite everything that was done to prevent it from existing is worth noting. Someone wanted this to disappear. It did not entirely disappear. That is something. That is where we leave Adrian, Vega tonight, in his car on Biscayne Boulevard, watching the lights, watching the city do what cities do, move and breathe and fill with noise, while something patient and enormous watches back. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is. This community is spread across every time zone on Earth, and there is something that feels right about that. All of you out there in the dark, listening, staying awake with questions that the daylight does not have satisfying answers for. Share this episode with someone who needs a reason to look a little more carefully at the world. Leave us a review wherever you listen, and if you have a story, a witness account, an experience you cannot explain, a thing you saw that the official version does not cover, our contact information is in the description. We will keep the light on, or at least we will keep asking what is behind it. Sleep well, or don't. End. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the most quietly persistent questions in conspiracy research, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It truly makes a difference in keeping these stories coming to you. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out tremendously as well. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. Finally, If you enjoy what we do here, consider subscribing. It means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story. This investigation was inspired by suggestions from Unanimous Thix9 and Todd Rockwell. Thank you both for bringing this topic to our attention. The sky doesn't make noise when you look at it. It doesn't resist observation, it simply exists, vast and indifferent exactly as it has always appeared to be. But somewhere in the archives of human thought, buried beneath centuries of scientific consensus and cultural agreement, there exists a question that refuses to disappear completely. What if everything we believe about the sky is wrong? Not metaphorically wrong, not philosophically incomplete, actually structurally, fundamentally wrong. The thought arrived on a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way except for the conversation that wouldn't leave my mind. I had been reading through old cosmological texts, the kind of material that rarely surfaces in modern education, but exists in abundance if you know where to look. Religious manuscripts, ancient astronomical records, pre-scientific descriptions of the universe written by cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, and they all said the same thing. The sky, according to these sources, was solid, not metaphorically firm in its permanence but physically solid, a structure, barrier, a ceiling that separated the world we inhabit from something else entirely. I dismissed it immediately. Of course I did. We live in an age where satellites orbit overhead, where we've sent probes beyond our solar system, where the very concept of a solid sky sounds like the superstition of people who didn't know better. But the dismissal felt reflexive rather than reasoned, and that distinction bothered me more than the claim itself, so I kept reading. Chapter 1. The Ancient Sky. The cosmology of ancient civilizations was not primitive guesswork. It was systematic, detailed, and remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. The Hebrews, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the early Greeks, indigenous cultures across the Americas and Asia, all described the sky using the same fundamental structure. A solid expanse above the earth, waters above this expanse, waters below. The heavens as something you could not pass through, only observe. The book of Genesis describes it explicitly in the creation account. On the second day, God creates a firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below. The word used in Hebrew is rakia, which translates to something beaten out, hammered flat, stretched like metal. It is described as strong, unyielding, transparent but tangible. This wasn't metaphor. The ancient cosmographers were describing what they believed to be the literal architecture of reality. I spent weeks reading through original texts, translations, scholarly commentaries. The consistency was staggering. The book of Job describes the sky as hard as a molten mirror. The Psalms refer to the firmament as strong, established, praiseworthy in its construction. The prophet Isaiah speaks of God stretching out the heavens like a curtain, spreading them like a tent to dwell in. These are not poetic flourishes, they are architectural descriptions. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, one of the oldest creation myths we have, describes Marduk creating the sky from the body of Tiamat, the primordial chaos monster. He splits her in half. One half becomes the earth, the other becomes the sky, but critically it remains a body, solid, formed, a structure that holds back the cosmic waters that existed before creation. The text is specific about this. Marduk sets guards at the sky to ensure the waters do not escape. He creates bolts and locks. He establishes watchers. The sky is not empty space. It is a constructed barrier with a specific function: containment. Egyptian cosmology operates on similar principles. Nut, the sky goddess, is depicted in tomb paintings and temple reliefs as a woman arching over the earth, her body forming the vault of heaven. Her fingertips touch the eastern horizon. Her toes touch the western horizon. Between her body and the earth, everything exists. She's not symbolic, she's structural. The Egyptian creation myth from Heliopolis describes the primordial mound rising from the waters of Nun, the infinite ocean. The sky is created as a separation, a division that creates space for life. but it is always described as something above, something that must be held up, often by the god Shu, who stands between earth and sky, arms raised, preventing collapse. This image appears everywhere in Egyptian art. The sky must be supported. It has weight. It exerts pressure. It is not void. Hindu cosmology takes the layered approach. The universe consists of multiple lokas, or realms, stacked vertically. Above the earth is the atmosphere, then various celestial realms, then the abode of the gods. Each layer is distinct, separated by boundaries. The highest realm, Brahmaloka, sits at the top, but even it is contained within a larger cosmic structure. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in existence, describes the sky as being held up by pillars. The Vishnu Purana speaks of cosmic shells, layers of reality encased one within another like nested spheres. The outermost shell is described as impenetrable, beyond which nothing exists. In China, ancient cosmology described the sky as a dome or canopy covering a square earth. The Zhoubi Suanjing, an astronomical text from around the 1st century, presents calculations based on the sun moving in a circular path above a flat plain beneath a celestial dome. The text includes mathematical formulas for predicting solar and lunar positions based on this model. These weren't religious texts, they were technical manuals. In the Americas, the pattern continues. The Hopi emergence narrative describes the people travelling upward through multiple worlds, each with its own sky ceiling. When the sky of one world became corrupt or exhausted, the people would find a sipapu, an opening, and climb through to the next level above. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems in the ancient world. They could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They tracked Venus with precision that rivals modern calculations. Their long count calendar is a mathematical achievement that still impresses scholars. And yet they describe the sky as bounded. The Maya cosmos consisted of 13 layered heavens above the earth and 9 layered underworlds below. Each level was distinct, ruled by different gods, accessible only through death or shamanic journey. The sky was not infinite. It was structured, divided, ordered. The Aztec cosmology follows similar patterns. The Codex Vaticanus depicts the universe as layers, with the earth in the middle and multiple sky levels stacked above. The highest level, Omeokon, is the dwelling place of the dual god Ometeotl, but even this supreme realm is contained within the overall structure. I started keeping a list. Every culture I examined, every ancient cosmological text, every creation myth and astronomical treatise, they all agreed. The sky is solid. The sky is bounded. The sky is a structure, not a void. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Phoenicians, the ancient Persians, the Norse with their Yggdrasil world tree holding up multiple realms, the Aboriginal Australians with their sky-world ancestors, the Polynesian navigators who mapped the stars with incredible precision but described the heavens as a dome resting on the horizon. I found myself asking, why would every major culture independently arrive at the same conclusion? The standard answer is that ancient people simply didn't know better. They looked up, saw a blue expanse that seemed solid, and assumed it was. But that explanation requires us to believe that civilizations capable of building pyramids aligned to celestial events, capable of predicting eclipses and tracking planetary movements with astonishing accuracy, were simultaneously incapable of recognizing empty space when they saw it. It didn't add up. These cultures were observational. They watched the sky obsessively. They tracked stars, planets, the moon, the sun. They created calendars so precise that we still marvel at them today. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer used to predict astronomical positions, demonstrates a level of technical sophistication that seems impossible for its era. The builders of Stonehenge aligned massive stones to solar and lunar events with precision that required generations of careful observation. The Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. The Mayan observatory at Chichen Itza tracks the equinoxes with architectural precision. These were not primitive people making wild guesses. They were careful, systematic observers of the heavens. And yet, across all of that careful observation, none of them described the sky as infinite empty space. They described a boundary. Not because they lacked imagination, but because that's what they observed, or believed they observed, or were taught to observe. The question that kept nagging at me was simpler than I wanted to admit. What if they were right? Chapter 2. The Shift in Understanding. The transformation in how humanity understood the sky did not happen gradually. It happened abruptly, during what we now call the scientific revolution, roughly between the 16th and 18th centuries. Before this period, European cosmology still followed the ancient model. The Ptolemaic system, developed by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, described Earth at the centre of nested crystalline spheres. Each sphere carried a celestial body: moon, sun, planets, stars. Beyond the outermost sphere lay the primum mobile, the first mover that caused all celestial motion. Beyond that, the empyrean, the dwelling place of God and the angels. This was not considered religious mythology. It was science. Ptolemy's Almagest was the authoritative astronomical text for over 1,000 years. It made predictions, it provided calculations, it worked within the observational limits of the time. The sky was the firmament, the heavens were layered spheres, and Earth sat at the centre of a bounded creation. This was not controversial. It was simply how things were understood to be. University professors taught it, navigators used it, the church endorsed it, but so did secular scholarship. Then, within the span of a few generations, everything changed. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, proposing that the sun, not Earth, sat at the centre of the cosmos. The book was dedicated to Pope Paul III and presented as a mathematical convenience, a way to simplify calculations, not necessarily a claim about physical reality. The introduction, written by Andreas Osiander without Copernicus's knowledge, explicitly stated that the heliocentric model was merely a computational tool, not a description of how things actually were. This disclaimer allowed the book to circulate without immediate condemnation, but the idea was out, and it began to spread. In 1610, Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the sky and observed moons orbiting Jupiter. This was significant because it proved that not everything in the heavens orbited Earth. If Jupiter had its own satellites, then the Ptolemaic model of Earth-centered spheres was incomplete at minimum, wrong at maximum. Galileo also observed the phases of Venus, which made sense in a heliocentric model, but required awkward explanations in a geocentric one. He saw mountains on the moon, proving that celestial bodies were not perfect, unchanging spheres but physical objects with terrain and features. His observations were real. His telescope showed things that were genuinely there. But the interpretation of what those observations meant, that required a leap. Johannes Kepler, working from Tycho Brahe's meticulous astronomical data, formulated 3 laws of planetary motion. Planets orbit the sun in ellipses, not circles. They move faster when closer to the sun. The orbital period relates to the size of the orbit through a specific mathematical ratio. These laws described planetary motion with unprecedented accuracy, but they didn't explain why planets moved this way. They were descriptive, not explanatory. Then came Isaac Newton. In 1687, Newton published Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the Principia. In it, he formulated the law of universal gravitation. Every mass attracts every other mass with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This was revolutionary not because it described new observations, but because it unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics under a single principle. The same force that makes an apple fall makes the moon orbit Earth. The heavens and Earth follow the same laws. Suddenly the sky was not a structure but a void, not a ceiling but infinite space, not a boundary but an invitation to endlessness. The crystalline spheres dissolved. The empyrean vanished. In their place, emptiness, governed by invisible forces extending forever. The shift was presented as enlightenment, as humanity finally seeing clearly after millennia of ignorance. and perhaps that's exactly what it was. But what struck me, reading through the transition documents, was how little actual proof was required for people to abandon the old model entirely. No one went up and touched the sky to confirm it wasn't solid. No one demonstrated that the ancient descriptions were physically impossible. What happened was that a new framework was proposed, one that made mathematical sense within certain assumptions, and the old framework was discarded not because it was disproven, but because it was no longer needed. Consider what actually changed. Observations of planetary motion existed before Copernicus. The same data that supported the Ptolemaic model was reinterpreted to support the Copernican model. Ptolemy could predict eclipses. So could Copernicus. Both systems worked mathematically. The choice between them was not purely empirical. It was aesthetic, philosophical. The Copernican model was simpler. It eliminated some of the complex epicycles, circles within circles that Ptolemy required. But simplicity is not proof of truth. Newton's gravity was more troubling. It worked brilliantly. It predicted the motion of celestial bodies with precision that still impresses today. But Newton himself admitted he had no idea what gravity actually was. He could describe its effects, but not its mechanism. In the Principia, he wrote, "I have not as yet been able to discover the reason for these properties of gravity from phenomena, and I do not feign hypotheses. Gravity was action at a distance, an invisible force with no physical medium. Objects attracted each other across vast emptiness without touching, without any mechanical connection. This was, philosophically, just as mysterious as crystalline, spheres, but it was useful, and utility, in the emerging scientific culture, began to matter more than explanation. The firmament didn't collapse under the weight of evidence. It was replaced by a model that served the needs of the new era. Navigation required precise planetary predictions. The Copernican model provided them. Engineering required understanding forces and motion. Newton provided that. The old cosmology, with its bounded heavens and purposeful structure, didn't fit the mechanical philosophy that was emerging. Not because it was proven false, but because it asked the wrong kinds of questions. I started to wonder, what if the ancient model wasn't wrong? What if it was simply reframed in a way that served different purposes? The question felt dangerous, not because it challenged science, but because it challenged the story we tell about progress. We are supposed to have moved from darkness into light, from superstition into knowledge, but what if we moved from one explanation into another, and both were incomplete? What if the shift from firmament to infinite space was not discovery, but decision? I kept reading. The more I learned about the scientific revolution, the more I realized how contingent it all was. Copernicus hesitated to publish, fearing ridicule. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition. Kepler spent years in poverty. Newton had a nervous breakdown and abandoned science for alchemy and theology. These were not triumphant heroes effortlessly overthrowing ignorance. They were men struggling with ideas that didn't quite fit, models that explained some things but not others, observations that could be interpreted multiple ways. And in the end, the model that won was not the one that was proven true, but the one that proved useful. Useful for what? For the emerging commercial empires that needed navigation. For the burgeoning industrial economy that needed mechanics. For the philosophical project of replacing divine purpose with material causation. The infinite universe served those purposes, the bounded firmament did not. So the firmament disappeared, not because anyone went up and proved it wasn't there, but because the new story was more convenient than the old one. Chapter 3. The Modern Firmament Theory. The modern firmament theory is not what most people imagine when they hear the phrase. It's not a claim that the sky's made of glass or crystal. It's not about a literal dome you could touch if you flew high enough. It's about Earth as a contained system. I encountered the theory through forums, video essays, independent researchers who approach cosmology from outside institutional science. The tone varies wildly. Some approach it with religious conviction, others with scientific skepticism turned inward, still others with the calm detachment of people exploring an idea simply to see where it leads. But the core claim remains consistent. Humanity lives inside a closed environment. The sky in this model is not infinite. It is bounded, not by a visible wall, but by a barrier that prevents passage beyond a certain point. Space in this framework is not a place you can travel to. It is a region, a layer of the system, but not an exit. The stars are not distant suns trillions of miles away, but lights within the system itself, fixed or moving along predetermined paths. This is not presented as fantasy. It's presented as the result of questioning assumptions that have become so fundamental we no longer recognise them as assumptions. I started cataloguing the core arguments. They fell into several categories. First, the nature of Earth itself. Modern cosmology describes Earth as a sphere rotating on its axis once every 24 hours, orbiting the Sun at approximately 67,000 miles per hour, while the entire solar system moves through the galaxy at roughly 500,000 miles per hour. Firmament theorists ask, why don't we feel this motion? The standard answer is that we're moving with the Earth, so there's no sensation of velocity, but they counter. We feel motion in airplanes, we feel motion in cars, we feel the rotation of carnival rides, yet we feel nothing from Earth's supposed rotation, orbit, or galactic movement. The response involves reference frames and constant velocity versus acceleration. Objects in constant motion don't produce sensation unless they change speed or direction. Earth's rotation is constant, so we don't feel it. But firmament researchers push back. Earth's rotation should produce measurable effects. The Coriolis effect, yes, but also more direct evidence. Long-range artillery must account for Earth's rotation in their calculations. Snipers, in theory, should need to adjust for it, yet the adjustments are minimal or absent in practice. They point to experiments. The Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887 attempted to detect Earth's motion through the luminiferous ether. It found no motion. The experiment was repeated multiple times with increasingly sophisticated equipment. Same result, no detectable motion. The standard interpretation is that this disproved the ether theory and led to special relativity. But firmament theorists suggest an alternative. Maybe the experiment detected exactly what was there, an Earth that isn't moving. Second, the nature of water. Firmament theory emphasises that water always finds its level. Oceans, lakes, rivers, they form level surfaces. Water does not curve around spheres at the scale we observe it. The standard explanation is gravity. Gravity pulls water toward the centre of Earth's mass, creating a curved surface that appears level locally but is globally spherical. Firmament theorists argue that this requires assuming what you're trying to prove. We know water is level. We observe this directly. The claim that it's actually curved relies entirely on accepting that Earth is a sphere. But if Earth is not a sphere, then water being level is exactly what we should expect. They point to large-scale observations. Looking across bodies of water, distant objects should be hidden by Earth's curvature. The formula is roughly 8 inches per mile squared. At 10 miles, an object should be hidden by approximately 67 feet of curvature. Yet there are photographs and videos showing objects visible at distances where they should be completely obscured. Buildings, mountains, islands, visible when they should be below the horizon. The standard response involves refraction, atmospheric lensing, mirages. Light bends as it passes through layers of air at different temperatures and densities, making distant objects appear higher than they actually are. But firmament researchers counter that refraction is invoked inconsistently, applied whenever observations don't match predictions but not accounted for when they do. It becomes a convenient explanation that can stretch to cover any discrepancy. Third, the nature of gravity itself. Modern physics describes gravity as a fundamental force, either as attraction between masses or as curvature of space-time caused by mass energy. Firmament theory questions whether gravity exists as described. Instead, they propose density and buoyancy as sufficient explanations for observed phenomena. Objects fall because they're denser than the medium around them. Helium balloons rise because they're less dense. No attractive force required. This seems simplistic. but they argue it's actually simpler than invoking a mysterious force that acts at infinite distance without any physical medium. Newton admitted he couldn't explain how gravity worked. Einstein reformulated it as geometry, but that doesn't explain what causes the curvature. Modern physics treats gravity as one of 4 fundamental forces, but it's the weakest and the most poorly understood. We can't unify it with quantum mechanics. We can't detect gravitational waves reliably despite building enormous interferometers. We can't explain dark matter or dark energy, except as placeholders for something that makes the math work. Firmament theorists suggest that maybe gravity is not fundamental. Maybe it's an interpretation imposed on observations that could be explained more simply if we abandon certain assumptions about Earth's shape and motion. Fourth, the nature of the sun, moon, and stars. In the firmament model, these are not what mainstream cosmology claims. The sun and moon are described as relatively local phenomena, moving above the Earth in circular or spiral paths. Their size and distance are much smaller than official figures. The stars are not distant suns, but lights of unknown nature, possibly fixed to the firmament itself or moving along predetermined paths within the enclosed system. This sounds absurd until you examine the arguments. The distance to the sun is calculated using parallax and astronomical units derived from assuming Earth's orbit. But if Earth isn't orbiting, those calculations collapse. The size of the sun is calculated from its assumed distance. Again, if the distance is wrong, the size calculation is wrong. What we actually observe is a bright disk in the sky that appears to be a certain angular size. Everything else is inference based on the heliocentric model. Firmament researchers point out that the sun and moon appear to be the same angular size, which is why we get perfect solar eclipses. In the standard model, this is an extraordinary coincidence. The sun is 400 times larger than the moon, and happens to be 400 times farther away, making them appear identical in size from Earth. In the firmament model, the sun and moon are simply local objects of similar size and distance. No coincidence required. The stars present their own puzzles. Polaris, the North Star, remains fixed in position, while all other stars rotate around it. This makes sense in a geocentric model where the sky rotates above a stationary Earth. It requires more complex explanation in a heliocentric model where Earth is rotating, orbiting, and moving through the galaxy. Star trails, long exposure photographs showing stars moving in circular arcs around Polaris, look exactly like what you'd expect if the stars were fixed to a rotating dome above a stationary Earth. Of course, they also look like what you'd expect from a rotating Earth beneath a vast distant star field. The observations don't distinguish between models, the interpretation does. Fifth, the nature of space itself. Firmament theory claims that space as commonly understood, infinite void, vacuum, filled with distant galaxies, may not exist as described. Instead, space might be a region within the enclosed system, the upper atmosphere transitioning into a different medium, possibly plasma, possibly something else. The vacuum of space might be real in the sense of low density, but not infinite, not extendable, not a place you can travel through to other planets or stars. This seems easily disprovable. After all, we've sent probes to other planets. We've landed rovers on Mars. We have photographs from throughout the solar system. But firmament theorists ask, how do you know? You've seen photographs and video. You've accepted official reports. But you haven't been there. You haven't verified it independently. You've trusted institutions to tell you the truth about what they've accomplished. And trust is not proof. This is where the theory becomes uncomfortable. It's not claiming that space agencies are lying about everything. It's suggesting that what they present as travel to distant planets might be something else. High-altitude flights, unmanned drones in the upper atmosphere, CGI enhancements, partial truths mixed with assumptions. Or it's suggesting that the probes are real, the data is real, but the interpretation is wrong. Maybe what we call Mars is not a distant planet, but something within the enclosed system, accessible at high altitude but not requiring interplanetary travel. These ideas are not presented with certainty. They're presented as possibilities that emerge when you stop assuming the standard model and start questioning what can actually be verified versus what must be accepted on authority. I realised, reading through these arguments, that firmament theory operates on a principle of radical scepticism. It trusts direct observation over expert interpretation. It trusts what you can verify over what you're told. This makes it appealing to people who distrust institutions, but it also makes it vulnerable to confirmation bias. If you decide to trust only what you can verify personally, you end up trusting very little, and in that void, alternative explanations flourish. But that doesn't mean the questions are invalid. The firmament theory survives not because people are ignorant, but because it asks questions that institutional science treats as settled beyond inquiry. And when questions are declared off limits, the very act of asking them becomes suspicious, which raises its own question. Why is questioning cosmology treated as more suspect than questioning politics, economics, or any other field where human interpretation plays a role? The answer might be that cosmology is foundational. If the shape of Earth and the nature of the sky are wrong, then everything built on those assumptions becomes questionable. The entire structure of modern knowledge rests on a few key premises about the physical world, and if those premises are challenged successfully, the structure falls. Maybe that's why the firmament theory persists, not because it's true, but because it's dangerous. And dangerous ideas, whether right or wrong, never truly die. They wait, dormant, until conditions allow them to resurface. I kept reading, uncertain whether I was approaching truth or falling into delusion. The line between them, I was beginning to realise, was thinner than I'd believed. Chapter 4. The Space Barrier. One of the most persistent claims within firmament research involves rocket launches and satellite footage. Specifically, the behaviour of objects as they ascend into the upper atmosphere and beyond. I started watching launch videos with a level of attention I'd never applied before. Not passively accepting what I saw, but actually observing, frame by frame in some cases. Firmament researchers point to videos of rocket launches, particularly those with onboard cameras that track the ascent. They claim that at a certain altitude, rockets do not continue straight up. Instead, trajectories curve, sharply and consistently, as if following the contour of something above. I watched a SpaceX Falcon launch from Cape Canaveral. The initial ascent is vertical, the rocket climbing straight up through the lower atmosphere. But around the time it passes through the densest cloud layers, somewhere between 40 and 60,000 feet, the trajectory begins to arc. Gradually at first, then more pronounced. The official explanation is orbital mechanics. Rockets curve because they are entering orbit, which requires horizontal velocity, not just vertical ascent. To orbit Earth, an object must move sideways fast enough that its fall toward Earth is balanced by its forward motion. This requires building up tremendous horizontal speed. The trajectory makes perfect sense within the framework of a spherical Earth in infinite space. You don't go straight up because straight up leads nowhere useful. You curve to build orbital velocity. But firmament researchers argue that the curve is too consistent, too pronounced, too early in the ascent to be explained purely by orbital insertion. They suggest that rockets curve because they encounter a boundary, and the only way to remain aloft is to follow that boundary, rather than attempting to penetrate it. I watched more launches: Russian Soyuz, Chinese Long March, European Ariane, Indian PSLV. Every launch, regardless of the agency or the stated mission, followed the same pattern. Vertical ascent, then curve, then horizontal acceleration. Is this evidence of a barrier, or is it simply how orbital mechanics work? The answer depends entirely on which model you start with. I looked for videos of rockets attempting purely vertical flights, missiles designed to go straight up rather than achieve orbit. The footage was harder to find, but it existed. High-altitude research rockets, ballistic missile tests. These also curved, though their paths were different from orbital launches. Firmament theorists point out that no rocket maintains a purely vertical trajectory beyond a certain altitude. They all curve, they all level off, they all behave as if following the inside surface of a dome, but orbital mechanics requires curves. Missiles follow ballistic arcs governed by their velocity and angle of launch. The observations don't distinguish between models without already assuming one. Then there's the footage itself, or rather the lack of certain kinds of footage. Firmament theorists ask, why is there no unedited, continuous video of a rocket or probe leaving Earth's atmosphere and travelling into deep space? Every transition from Earth to space involves cuts, edits, camera switches. We see the launch, we see orbit, we see images from space, but we never see the journey between in real time. I searched extensively. I found promotional videos, compilation reels, documentary footage. NASA's archive contains thousands of hours of material. SpaceX live streams launches regularly. The International Space Station broadcasts continuously. But an uncut video showing the continuous transition from ground level to orbital altitude, I couldn't find one. The standard answer is practicality. Rockets travel too fast for continuous tracking from a single camera. Distances are too vast for real-time transmission. Without compression, continuous footage would be boring. Minutes of empty sky followed by the rocket becoming a tiny dot. These explanations make sense, but the absence is noted, catalogued, treated as suspicious by firmament researchers. I kept searching. I found onboard camera footage from various launches. Typically the video shows the rocket ascending, clouds falling away, the sky darkening to black, and then cut, switch to external view, or switch to animation explaining what's happening. When continuous onboard footage exists, it often shows strange things. Fisheye lenses creating horizon curves that shift and bend unnaturally. The Earth appearing convex in one frame, concave in another, depending on camera position and lens distortion. Firmament researchers catalogue these distortions obsessively. They claim that the curved horizon we see in space footage is an artifact of wide-angle lenses, not evidence of Earth's spherical shape. They show comparison videos, demonstrating how fisheye lenses can make flat surfaces appear curved. The space agencies acknowledge that wide-angle lenses are used. They're necessary to capture the full view in cramped spaces, but they argue that the curvature of Earth is visible even in footage shot with minimal distortion. Firmament researchers counter by asking for raw footage straight from the camera before processing. They want access to original files, metadata intact, showing exactly what cameras captured before any enhancement or correction. This raw footage is rarely available to the public. When it is released, it often comes after processing for color correction, stabilization, or format conversion. The original data exists in proprietary formats, archived by space agencies, not accessible for independent verification. Is this evidence of deception? Or is it simply how institutions handle technical data? I started noticing patterns in how launches were broadcast. Live streams from SpaceX would show the rocket ascending, then switch to animation as it climbed beyond visual range. When the feed returned to live footage, the rocket was already in space, or the payload was being deployed, or the booster was descending for landing. The critical moments, the actual passage from atmosphere to space, were consistently absent from direct coverage. Firmament theorists point to specific anomalies, videos showing objects appearing to hit an invisible ceiling, bubbles in space footage, suggesting underwater filming, harnesses visible on astronauts during supposedly zero-gravity demonstrations, green screens detected in background analysis of ISS broadcasts. Each anomaly has official explanations. Bubbles are condensation or ice particles. Harnesses are equipment tethers for safety. Green screens are used for educational demonstrations, not actual space footage. The ceiling effect is debris separation or stage jettison captured at angles that create optical illusions. I examined the evidence. Some of it was clearly misidentified. A reflection mistaken for a bubble. Camera artifacts mistaken for green screen edges. Perspective tricks making straight lines appear to curve. But some of it was harder to dismiss. Videos where the physics seemed wrong. Objects moving in ways that didn't match the zero-gravity environment they were supposed to be in. Footage where astronauts appeared to be supported by invisible wires, their movements constrained in ways that suggested harnesses rather than free-floating. The most troubling aspect wasn't any single piece of evidence. It was the cumulative weight of anomalies, each individually explainable, but collectively suggesting something off. Or it was confirmation bias, seeing what you want to see, finding patterns in noise. I couldn't prove it was suspicious, but I also couldn't dismiss the observations entirely. What bothered me most was the realization that I had never questioned it before. I had simply accepted that space travel looked a certain way because that's how it was presented. But presentation is not proof. In the absence of certain types of evidence, unedited continuous footage, publicly available raw data, transparent access to verification, that absence might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. The firmament theory doesn't require vast conspiracy. It only requires institutional interpretation of data that we can't personally verify. And in the gap between what we're shown and what we can confirm, alternative explanations find room to breathe. Chapter 5. The Silence Above. One of the quieter elements of the firmament theory involves a simple question. What does it look like to leave Earth? Not from Earth, not looking back at Earth, but leaving. The act of passage from inside the atmosphere to outside it, uninterrupted, unmediated. I searched for this footage with genuine curiosity. I wanted to see what it looked like when a camera mounted on a rocket or satellite transitioned from sky to space, the moment when blue gives way to black, when atmosphere ends and void begins. I found compilations, edited sequences, animations, artist renderings. I found footage from the International Space Station showing Earth from orbit. I found re-entry videos showing the fiery descent back through the atmosphere. I found promotional material from space agencies, beautiful and inspiring, but I did not find unedited, continuous footage of the crossing itself. This absence is not proof of anything. It could be explained a dozen different ways, all of them mundane. Technical limitations, bandwidth constraints, editorial choices for public consumption, the sheer duration of ascent making continuous coverage impractical. But it is an absence, and firmament researchers treat absences as data. The theory suggests that the firmament does not need to be hidden if no one is looking for it. If the assumption is that space is infinite and accessible, then the lack of direct evidence for crossing into it becomes invisible. We see what we expect to see, and we explain away everything else. This idea troubled me more than I wanted to admit. How much of what I believed about the world came from direct experience versus mediated information? I had never been to space. I had never seen Earth from orbit with my own eyes. I had never witnessed a rocket launch in person, let alone tracked its entire ascent beyond the limits of visibility. Everything I knew about space came from images, videos, reports, textbooks, authorities. I trusted those sources. Of course I did. They came from institutions with resources, expertise, decades of accumulated knowledge. NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, SpaceX. These organizations employed thousands of scientists and engineers. They had budgets in the billions. They produced tangible results, satellites that provided GPS, communications, weather forecasting. But trust is not verification. And verification, in the modern world, has become almost impossible for individuals. I started thinking about how knowledge works in a technological society. Most of what we know second-hand. We read it in books written by experts. We see it on screen showing footage from places we'll never visit. We accept it as true because rejecting it would require rejecting the entire edifice of specialised knowledge that makes modern life function. This is not inherently wrong. Specialisation is necessary. No single person can verify everything. We rely on institutions, peer review, reputation, consensus. But what happens when those institutions have interests beyond truth? When they serve political, economic or ideological purposes? Space exploration, from its inception, was entangled with Cold War politics. The space race was not about science. It was about demonstrating technological superiority, projecting power, claiming ideological victory. Sputnik terrified the United States not because it was dangerous, but because it symbolized Soviet capability. The Apollo program was a response to that terror. Kennedy's speech about going to the moon was not a scientific proclamation. It was a strategic decision. We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it serves national interest. Firmament researchers point to this history and ask, if space exploration began as propaganda, how much of it remains propaganda? They note that the most iconic images of space exploration, the Apollo moon landing, Earthrise, the blue marble photograph, all emerged during the height of the Cold War. All were produced by a government with massive incentive to demonstrate superiority. All have been questioned, analysed, scrutinised for anomalies. The moon landing deniers have their own extensive literature, their own claimed evidence of staged footage, impossible shadows, missing stars. I was not researching moon landing conspiracies specifically, but the methodologies overlapped. Question official, narratives, examine footage for inconsistencies, demand primary sources. The firmament theory doesn't necessarily deny that Apollo happened. It questions what Apollo actually accomplished. Maybe astronauts went up. Maybe they orbited in high altitude. Maybe they landed somewhere. But did they land on a rock orbiting Earth at 250,000 miles away? Or did they land on something within the enclosed system, something we call the moon but misunderstand fundamentally? These questions feel absurd, but absurdity is not refutation. I kept returning to the central problem. Everything I knew about space came through mediation. Cameras, computers, institutions, interpreters. I had no direct access to the phenomena itself. When I look at the moon through a telescope, I see a bright disk with visible features, craters, Maria, highlands, beautiful and detailed. But I'm seeing reflected sunlight, filtered through atmosphere, focused through glass. I'm not seeing the moon as it is. I'm seeing an optical representation. When I see footage from the ISS, I'm seeing compressed video transmitted from orbit, processed through multiple systems, displayed on a screen. The astronauts floating in zero gravity might be exactly what they appear to be, or they might be in a high-altitude aircraft in parabolic flight, or they might be in a carefully constructed set with hidden supports. I couldn't tell the difference from the footage alone. This is the epistemological problem at the heart of the firmament theory. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, an unprecedented distance from primary experience. We can see more than any previous generation but verify less. The firmament might exist or might not, but our relationship to truth has become so mediated that certainty is elusive regardless. Firmament researchers exploit this uncertainty. They ask questions designed to reveal how little we actually know versus how much we accept on authority. Have you personally measured the distance to the sun? Have you calculated Earth's circumference independently? Have you verified that satellites exist in the orbits claimed? Have you confirmed that the laws of physics operate the same everywhere in the universe? The answer to all of these is no for nearly everyone. We accept these things because experts tell us they're true, and most of the time, that's sufficient. The GPS on my phone works. Weather satellites provide accurate forecasts. The ISS is visible passing overhead on clear nights. But working doesn't prove the explanation. The geocentric model with complex epicycles also worked within its limits. Ptolemy's calculations produced accurate predictions for centuries. The model was useful without being true. Maybe our current model is the same. Useful, predictive, explanatory within certain bounds, but fundamentally wrong about the underlying structure of reality. The firmament theory suggests that we are not lied to so much as given interpretations that serve institutional purposes. The data might be real, the interpretation might be convenient, and in a world where direct verification is impossible, convenience can masquerade as truth indefinitely. Chapter 6: Antarctica and the Edge. Antarctica appears in almost every firmament discussion, often as the single most important piece of evidence for the theory. The claim is straightforward. Antarctica is not just a continent, it is a boundary. Not the southern edge of a spherical Earth, but the outer edge of the known world encircling everything else. In the firmament model, Antarctica functions as a perimeter, a wall of ice that surrounds the oceans and continents, marking the limit of the enclosed system. Beyond Antarctica, if the theory is correct, lies nothing, or something unknowable, or the edge of the firmament itself. This idea is not new. Before modern exploration, Antarctica existed in European imagination as Terra Australis Incognita, unknown, southern land. Medieval and Renaissance maps sometimes depicted it as a vast ring encircling the known continents, a counterbalance to the landmasses of the north. These maps were speculative. Cartographers included Terra Australis not from observation but from theory. They believed the world needed symmetry, that northern lands required southern equivalents to maintain balance, so they drew Antarctica before anyone had seen it. When actual exploration began in the 18th and 19th centuries, the picture that emerged was complicated. Captain James Cook circumnavigated Antarctica between 1772 and 1775, becoming the first explorer to cross the Antarctic Circle, but he never saw the mainland. He encountered impenetrable ice barriers that prevented further south penetration. He sailed along the ice edge for thousands of miles, mapping its extent but never confirming what lay beyond. Cook's journals describe the ice barrier as seemingly endless. He would sail parallel to it for days, weeks, always finding more ice, never finding passage. He concluded that if land existed beyond the ice, it was unreachable and uninhabitable. Firmament researchers point to Cook's voyage as evidence. He didn't circumnavigate a continent, he circumnavigated the ice barrier that surrounds the known world. The distance he travelled, over 60,000 miles, is far greater than the circumference of Antarctica as currently mapped. The official explanation is that Cook didn't sail in a tight circle around the continent. He meandered, followed ice flows, retreated and advanced based on conditions. His path was irregular, not a direct circumference, but the raw distance travelled remained striking. Later expeditions claim to have discovered and mapped the Antarctic mainland, but firmament researchers question these claims. They note that Antarctica is the least mapped, least verified continent. Most of its interior is inaccessible. What we call accurate maps are largely based on aerial surveys, satellite imagery, and ice-penetrating radar, all subject to interpretation. No one has walked across Antarctica following a route that would definitively confirm its shape. The few transcontinental expeditions followed predetermined paths, usually seeking the South Pole, not attempting to map the entire coastline or verify the overall structure. And then there's the Antarctic Treaty. Signed in Washington in December 1959, the Antarctic Treaty designated Antarctica as a scientific preserve. It banned military activity, prohibited mineral mining, suspended territorial claims, and established international cooperation in research. On its face, the treaty seems reasonable. Antarctica is harsh, remote, environmentally sensitive. International protection makes sense. But firmament theorists see something else. They note that the treaty was signed during the Cold War, a period when the United States and Soviet Union agreed on almost nothing. Yet both nations, along with 10 others, immediately signed a binding agreement about Antarctica. Why? What made Antarctica so important that ideological enemies found common ground there? The treaty's provisions are extensive. Article 1 prohibits any military activity. Article 7 allows any signatory nation to inspect any other nation's Antarctic stations at any time. Article 9 establishes regular consultative meetings to discuss Antarctic governance. But the most interesting provision is the implicit one. All territorial claims are frozen. 7 nations had claimed portions of Antarctica before the treaty. The treaty doesn't resolve these claims. It suspends them indefinitely. No new claims can be made. Existing claims cannot be enforced or expanded. Firmament researchers ask, why freeze territorial claims on a frozen wasteland? If Antarctica is just ice and rock with no strategic value, why bother with complex international governance? The official answer involves science and environmental protection. Antarctica is pristine, valuable for research, vulnerable to exploitation. The treaty preserves it for peaceful study. But firmament theorists suggest the treaty serves another purpose: controlling access. By making Antarctica an international preserve, no single nation can claim it, but also no independent expedition can explore it freely. I investigated this claim. I found that visiting Antarctica is indeed difficult. Tourism exists, but it's heavily regulated. Tour operators must follow strict protocols established by the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators. Landing sites are limited, activities are restricted. Independent travel is essentially impossible without permits, approvals, and enormous expense. Private expeditions to Antarctica's interior require permission from multiple governments, logistical support from approved contractors, insurance, emergency extraction plans. The barriers are not legal prohibitions, but practical impossibilities. You can visit Antarctica as a tourist, but you'll see what tour operators show you. You can conduct research there, but you'll work within established stations under treaty oversight. You cannot simply charter a boat, sail south, and explore independently. Firmament researchers catalogue stories of people who tried, adventurers who planned Antarctic expeditions and faced bureaucratic roadblocks, researchers whose projects were denied permits for vague reasons, filmmakers who requested access to interior regions and were told no. Are these restrictions about environmental protection or about preventing discovery of something that contradicts official narratives? I found one account particularly compelling. A private explorer claimed he wanted to sail along Antarctica's coast, filming continuously, creating a full video record of the entire perimeter. His stated goal was to verify Antarctica's shape and size independently. Never got approval. Authorities cited safety concerns, environmental regulations, lack of proper insurance. He tried multiple times over several years, adjusting his plans to meet objections. Each time new barriers appeared. Eventually he gave up. His account, posted in various forums, reads like someone defeated by bureaucracy rather than physical impossibility. The message: you can't go there because we won't let you. Is this evidence of conspiracy? Or is it simply how institutions manage risk and protect sensitive environments? I couldn't answer definitively, but the pattern was there. Antarctica is unique in being both accessible in theory and restricted in practice. You can go, but only under conditions that ensure you see what you're supposed to see. Firmament theory suggests that if Antarctica is the edge, the perimeter wall of the enclosed world, then it must be protected not by force but by procedure. Make it legal to visit but impractical to explore. Allow research but control where researchers go. Permit tourism but limit what tourists can access. This is conspiracy theory methodology, finding sinister purpose in bureaucratic complexity. But it's also worth noting that Antarctic governance is genuinely unusual. No other landmass is subject to such comprehensive international control. No other region is simultaneously claimed by multiple nations and governed by none. The firmament theory asks, what is Antarctica hiding? And the unsettling answer might be the fact that it's not hiding anything. It's openly there, surrounding everything, and we're just not allowed to look closely enough to realise it. I looked at maps of Antarctica. The official ones show a roughly circular continent centred on the South Pole. The firmament model depicts it as a ring around the outer edge of a flat plain. Both maps use the same data points, the same coastline observations, the same ice formations, but they project that data onto fundamentally different shapes. One assumes a sphere, one assumes a plane, and from where we stand looking at paper or screens, we cannot tell which projection is true. Chapter 7. Control through cosmology. The firmament theory expands beyond questions of physics. It becomes, at its deepest level, a theory about purpose. If Earth is a ball spinning through infinite space, then humanity is a cosmic accident. We are the product of random processes, isolated in a vast and indifferent universe. There is no centre. There is no purpose. There is only the cold mathematics of matter and energy. This is not incidental to modern cosmology. It is foundational. I started reading the history of how scientific cosmology displaced religious cosmology. The shift from geocentrism to heliocentrism is often presented as purely scientific. Better observations, better mathematics, better explanation. But the philosophical implications were just as significant as the technical ones. The geocentric model placed humanity at the centre of creation. Not the physical centre necessarily, but the focal point. Everything revolved around Earth. The heavens moved for us to observe. The sun existed to give us light and warmth. The stars marked time and season for our benefit. This was not vanity. It was coherence. If God created the universe, and creation had a purpose, then humanity's position at the centre made theological sense. We were the purpose. The cosmos existed in relation to us. The heliocentric model shattered that coherence. Suddenly Earth was just another planet, orbiting just another star in just another galaxy among billions. We were not central. We were peripheral, cosmically insignificant. Copernicus understood this. That's why he hesitated to publish. He knew the implications extended beyond astronomy into theology. If Earth is not the centre, then what is humanity's relationship to the divine? Giordano Bruno took the next step. He proposed that the universe was infinite, filled with countless stars and planets, possibly harbouring other life. He was burned at the stake in 1600, officially for heresy, but the specific heresy was cosmological, denying the uniqueness of Earth and humanity. The Church resisted heliocentrism, not because of stubbornness, but because they understood what was at stake. If the cosmos has no centre, then it has no hierarchy. If it has no hierarchy, then it has no order imposed by divine will. If there is no divine order, then there is no transcendent meaning. Modern secular thinkers celebrate this as liberation from superstition. We don't need cosmic purpose. We create our own meaning. We are free from the burden of predetermined significance. But firmament theorists ask, what if that freedom is actually loss? If Earth is enclosed, if we live inside a created system with boundaries and structure, then everything changes. We are not random. We are placed. We are contained. We are perhaps observed. Purpose becomes possible. Again, not as human construction, but as cosmic fact. The psychological implications are profound. An infinite universe invites nihilism. A bounded creation invites meaning. And meaning, whether comforting or terrifying, changes how people live. I found myself thinking about Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation, God is dead. He didn't mean this literally. He meant that modernity had made God unnecessary. The infinite mechanical universe explained itself without divine intervention. Humanity no longer needed theology to understand the cosmos. But Nietzsche also understood the consequences. If God is dead, if cosmic purpose disappears, then we face the abyss of meaninglessness. The death of God was not victory, but crisis. We killed God, Nietzsche wrote, and now we must become gods ourselves to be worthy of the deed. Modern culture has not become godlike. It has become fractured, anxious, searching desperately for meaning in a universe that offers none. Depression, suicide, addiction, despair. These are not just personal failures, but existential responses to cosmic insignificance. Firmament researchers argue that this is intentional, not that specific individuals conspired to make people miserable, but that the shift from bounded creation to infinite void served powerful interests. If humanity has no cosmic purpose, then purpose becomes whatever authorities define it as: work, consumption, national service, ideological commitment. These fill the void left by transcendent meaning. People without cosmic significance are easier to control because they must find significance somewhere, and institutions are happy to provide it. This sounds paranoid, but it's also historically demonstrable. The rise of totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century coincided with the full internalization of cosmic meaninglessness. Fascism, communism, various nationalisms all offered collective purpose to replace lost cosmic purpose. Even liberal democracy, with its emphasis on individual freedom and material prosperity, functions as a substitute meaning system. We are free to pursue happiness, which in practice means pursuing wealth, status, pleasure. These are not nothing, but they are not cosmic significance either. The firmament theory suggests that cosmology is not neutral. How we understand the sky shapes how we understand ourselves. An infinite void produces one kind of human. A bounded creation produces another. I thought about medieval Europe, often dismissed as superstitious and backward. But medieval people lived in a cosmos saturated with meaning. Every star was an angel. Every planet had divine significance. The heavens declared the glory of God. Life was hard, often brutal, but it was not meaningless. Modern people live in comfort unimaginable to medieval peasants. We have technology, medicine, leisure, but we also have epidemic rates of depression, a mental health crisis that shows no signs of abating despite increasing access to treatment. Could this crisis be cosmological? Could the loss of a meaningful universe create psychological damage that no amount of therapy or medication can fully address? Firmament theorists believe so. They argue that returning to a bounded cosmos, re-establishing Earth as a created place rather than a cosmic accident, could restore meaning not as belief, but as fact. This is where the theory becomes most controversial, because if the firmament exists, then someone created it. And if someone created it, then we must ask why, and what they want from us, and what happens if we ignore their purposes. These are theological questions masquerading as cosmological ones. Science is not equipped to answer them. Science deals with mechanism, not meaning. It can tell us how things work, but not why they exist or what we should do about it. The firmament theory reintroduces purpose as a scientific question. If Earth is enclosed, that enclosure was deliberate, the system was designed. And design implies designer, which implies intent, which implies meaning. Modern science fled from this centuries ago, not because design was disproven, but because methodologically limiting science to mechanism made it more productive. You can study how planets orbit without asking why planets exist. You can understand gravity without understanding purpose, but the limitation was methodological, not metaphysical. Science chose not to ask certain questions, not because they were invalid, but because they were outside its scope. Firmament theory asks those questions again, not through theology, but through cosmology. It treats the structure of the universe as evidence for purpose, and purpose as evidence for structure. This circularity is intentional. If you start from materialism, the assumption that only matter and energy exist, then purpose is illusion. But if you start from purpose, the assumption that existence has meaning, then materialism is incomplete. The choice between these starting points is not scientific, it's philosophical. And philosophy, unlike science, does not settle questions through experiment. It settles them through commitment. Modern culture committed to materialism, not because it was proven true, but because it was useful. It enabled technological progress, economic growth, social engineering. It made the world predictable, controllable, exploitable. But it also made the world empty, and emptiness, no matter how comfortable, eventually becomes unbearable. The firmament theory offers an alternative, not a return to medieval superstition, but a reframing of modern knowledge. Keep the observations, change the interpretation, recognise that the infinite void might be a choice rather than a discovery. And if it's a choice, we can choose differently. Chapter 8. The Psychological Barrier. The strongest argument against the firmament theory is not scientific, it's psychological. The idea of a solid sky feels impossible, not unlikely, not improbable, impossible in a way that bypasses reason and settles directly into instinct. We have internalized the infinite universe so completely that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. It's not that we've examined the evidence and found the firmament lacking. It's that the firmament violates the shape of the world as we've been taught to imagine it. And that, firmament researchers argue, is exactly how the system works. I started paying attention to my own reactions as I researched. Every time I encountered a firmament claim that felt compelling, I noticed a reflex, a voice in my head that said, "This can't be true." Not "this doesn't seem true," or "I need more evidence." Simply, "This can't be true." That reaction was automatic, instantaneous, occurring before any conscious evaluation of the claim itself. I recognized it as cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that occurs when new information contradicts existing beliefs. The human mind resists this discomfort. We have multiple strategies for reducing it: rejecting the new information, reinterpreting it to fit existing beliefs, or creating rationalizations that allow both to coexist. What we rarely do is actually change the foundational belief, because foundational beliefs are integrated into our entire understanding of reality. Changing them means rebuilding from scratch. The firmament theory, if true, would require exactly that kind of rebuilding. Everything I learned about the universe, from elementary school through university, would need to be re-examined. Not just astronomy, but physics, geology, history, philosophy. The entire edifice of modern knowledge rests on certain cosmological assumptions. If those assumptions are wrong, the edifice doesn't just modify, it collapses. This is terrifying. Not intellectually terrifying, but existentially so. It means that the authorities I trusted were wrong. The institutions that educated me failed. The consensus. Reality I share with billions of people is mistaken. More than mistaken, constructed. Built deliberately to produce a certain kind of understanding, a certain kind of human being. I found myself thinking about education, how we learn about the universe from childhood. Picture books showing the solar system, the planets orbiting the sun, Earth as a blue marble floating in black void. These images are presented as photographs, as direct representation of reality. But they're not. They're artist renderings, composites, CGI reconstructions based on data interpreted through models. The photograph of Earth from space that hangs in classrooms is usually a composite of multiple images stitched together and colour corrected for visual appeal. Nothing wrong with that inherently, but we're not told it's a composite. We're shown it as truth, and we internalise it as truth, and by the time we're old enough to question, the belief is so fundamental that questioning feels absurd. This is social conditioning. Not in the sinister sense of deliberate brainwashing, but in the mundane sense of how cultures transmit worldviews. Every society teaches its children a cosmology. Medieval Europe taught bounded heavens and divine hierarchy. Ancient Egypt taught the sky goddess Nut arching over the earth. Modern society teaches infinite space and cosmic insignificance. None of these cosmologies is self-evident. All require teaching, reinforcement, correction, when children's natural observations differ from approved understanding. I remembered being told as a child that the earth was round. I looked at the horizon, it appeared flat. I was told this was because the earth is very large and I was very small. The curvature exists but is imperceptible at ground level. I accepted this explanation. What choice did I have? Every adult, every teacher, every book agreed. Doubting would have meant doubting everything, isolating myself from consensus reality. So I learned to trust authority over observation. I learned that what appears true might be false, and what appears false might be true, and the way to navigate this is to trust experts. This is not unreasonable. Experts exist for good reason. Specialization is necessary, but it creates dependence. And dependence creates vulnerability to deception, whether intentional or accidental. Firmament theory survives because it identifies this vulnerability and exploits it. It asks, what if the experts are wrong? Not about everything, but about this one foundational thing. The resistance to that question is not rational. It's defensive. It's the mind protecting itself from chaos. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon. When people's worldviews are threatened, they don't respond with careful evaluation of evidence. They respond with increased commitment to existing beliefs, dismissal of contradictory information, and hostility towards sources of threat. This is called worldview defense. It's not conscious, it's automatic. And it operates below the level where reason can intervene. Firmament theorists understand this. That's why they frame their arguments carefully. They don't lead with, the earth is flat, because that triggers immediate rejection. Instead, they ask questions. They point to anomalies. They invite curiosity rather than demanding belief. The method is Socratic. Undermine certainty gradually. Create doubt. Show that what seems obvious might be assumption. Demonstrate that accepted answers don't fully address underlying questions. This works on some people. Those who already harbour doubts about authority, who feel alienated from mainstream consensus, who sense that something in the official narrative doesn't fit their experience. For them, the firmament theory is not absurd, it's liberating. It validates their suspicion that they've been lied to, manipulated, controlled. But it also creates new certainties just as rigid as the old ones. Firmament believers often become as dogmatic as the scientific materialists they oppose. They dismiss counter-arguments reflexively. They interpret every piece of evidence as confirmation. They retreat into echo chambers where their beliefs are never seriously challenged. This is the trap of conspiracy thinking. It begins with legitimate questions but ends with unfalsifiable worldviews. If all evidence against your theory can be explained as part of the conspiracy, then your theory becomes immune to disproof. The firmament theory walks this line. At its best, it's genuine inquiry into cosmological assumptions. At its worst, it's paranoid fantasy that sees deception everywhere. I tried to stay on the inquiry side, to ask questions without committing to answers, to examine evidence without deciding prematurely what it meant. But I felt the pull, the attraction of having an explanation that accounts for everything, the comfort of knowing or believing I know what others miss. This is the psychological allure of conspiracy theories generally. They promise hidden knowledge, special insight, the power of seeing through illusion. They elevate the believer above the deceived masses. This is ego gratification masquerading as truth-seeking, and it's dangerous because it feels like enlightenment. The firmament theory, specifically, offers something unique. It's not just about governments lying or corporations corrupting. It's about the fundamental nature of reality being other than we've been told. If true, it means we live in a creation, not an accident. We have purpose, not randomness. We are observed, not isolated. These are comforting ideas for people who find modern cosmology existentially devastating. The firmament offers meaning, structure, cosmic significance. But comfort is not truth, and the desire for meaning can override critical thinking just as easily as fear or anger can. I had to keep reminding myself, the fact that I want something to be true doesn't make it true. The fact that believing something would be psychologically beneficial doesn't make it correct. Truth is independent of preference. Reality doesn't care what we need it to be, but we care, and that caring shapes what we're willing to consider, what we're able to see, what we can accept. The psychological barrier to the firmament theory is not that it's too absurd to believe, it's that accepting it requires surrendering too much. The comfort of consensus, the trust in institutions, the shared reality that makes communication possible. These are not small things to surrender, and most people won't. Not because they've examined the evidence and found it lacking, but because the cost of belief is too high. The firmament theory survives on the margins, among people for whom the cost of disbelief has become higher than the cost of belief. People who have already lost trust, already feel alienated, already suspect that consensus reality is constructed rather than discovered. For them, the firmament is not absurdity, it's the truth that makes sense of everything else that doesn't. Chapter 9. The Cracks in the Sky. There are stories, scattered and unverified, of anomalies in the upper atmosphere. I started collecting them the way firmament researchers do, not with the assumption that they prove anything, but with the recognition that patterns emerge from accumulation. Strange sounds recorded by high-altitude balloons, hums and vibrations that don't correspond to known atmospheric phenomena. The frequency ranges are wrong for wind, too regular for turbulence, too persistent for equipment malfunction. I found a research paper from a team that launched weather balloons equipped with acoustic sensors. At altitudes above 100,000 feet, the sensors detected sounds described as humming or rumbling. The sounds occurred consistently at similar altitudes across multiple launches. The researchers noted them in their data but had no explanation. Atmospheric pressure at that height is too low for conventional sound propagation. Yet the sensors recorded something. The paper was published in a minor journal. I found no follow-up studies. The phenomenon was noted and abandoned, filed under unexplained and forgotten. Firmament researchers catalogue this as evidence of the barrier. They suggest the sounds are the firmament resonating, vibrating, responding to pressure from below or forces from beyond. Is that what it is? Or is it electromagnetic interference misinterpreted as sound? Or some atmospheric effect science hasn't yet explained? I couldn't know, but the sounds were recorded. That much was verifiable. Then there are the lights. Unexplained light patterns observed by pilots and astronomers. Not auroras, which are well understood. Not meteors or satellites or conventional aircraft. Something else. I read accounts from commercial pilots describing flashes above the cloud layer. Brief, intense, blue-white light that illuminates the sky at altitudes where nothing should be. The flashes don't fall like meteors. They don't move like aircraft. They appear, pulse, and vanish. One pilot described seeing these lights during a transoceanic flight. He reported them to air traffic control. They had no explanation. Other aircraft in the area saw nothing. His cockpit instruments showed no anomalies, but the lights were there, he insisted, visible for perhaps 5 or 10 seconds before disappearing. He filed a report. Aviation authorities investigated. No explanation was found. The incident was classified as unexplained atmospheric phenomenon and closed. Firmament theorists point to these reports as glimpses of the barrier. They suggest the lights are energy discharges where objects, meteors, space debris or something else, strike the firmament and disperse. In conventional cosmology, these lights might be sprites or elves, upper atmospheric electrical phenomena associated with thunderstorms, but the sightings firmament researchers catalogue occur in clear conditions without nearby storms, at altitudes higher than where sprites typically form. Again, unexplained, not proof. But the accumulation is notable. There are also reports from people who claim to have witnessed objects appearing to stop at a certain altitude. Rockets, high-altitude aircraft, even meteorites that seem to strike something invisible and bounce or disintegrate. One account described a rocket launched from a private facility, designed to reach extreme altitude. The launch was filmed. In the footage, the rocket ascends normally until it reaches approximately 300,000 feet. Then it appears to hit something. The trajectory changes abruptly. The rocket tumbles, breaks apart, and falls. The official explanation was structural failure due to atmospheric stress. But the failure occurred at an altitude where atmospheric pressure is negligible, and the change in trajectory was sudden, as if encountering resistance rather than failing from internal stress. Firmament researchers analysed the footage frame by frame. They claim the rocket didn't break from stress. It hit something solid, invisible, and shattered on impact. Could they be right? Or are they seeing what they want to see in ambiguous footage? I watched the video multiple times. The rocket does change trajectory suddenly. The breakup is rapid, but rockets are complex machines operating at extreme conditions. Failure can be sudden without requiring invisible barriers. Still, the footage is unsettling. Something happened at that altitude. Whether it was structural failure or impact with a boundary depends on assumptions I couldn't verify. Beyond these specific incidents, there's a broader pattern that firmament researchers find meaningful: the lack of high-altitude phenomena. We know a great deal about the troposphere, where weather occurs. We know somewhat less about the stratosphere, where aircraft fly. But beyond that, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, our knowledge becomes increasingly indirect, based on instruments, models, extrapolation. Firmament theorists ask, why are there no continuous observation stations in the upper atmosphere? Why do we rely on brief rocket flights and satellite data rather than permanent platforms? The official answer is engineering difficulty. Maintaining structures at extreme altitude is harder than orbiting satellites. The environment is hostile. Cost-benefit doesn't justify it, but the absence is noted. We have submarines in the deep ocean. We have stations in Antarctica. We have the ISS in space, but nothing in that transitional zone between atmosphere and void. Firmament researchers suggest this is intentional. If the firmament exists somewhere in the upper atmosphere, permanent observation platforms would detect it. Better to keep that region accessible only through brief controlled visits. Is this paranoid, or is it pattern recognition? I thought about how much of our cosmological understanding depends on that inaccessible zone. We can't go there personally. We can't station observers there. We must trust instruments, briefly deployed, reporting data that's interpreted through models we can't independently verify. The gap between what we observe directly and what we believe exists is enormous, and in that gap, uncertainty breeds alternative explanations. I found one account particularly compelling not because it proved anything, but because it illustrated the epistemological problem. An amateur group built a high-altitude balloon platform. They equipped it with cameras, sensors, GPS tracking. Their goal was to document the ascent from ground to maximum altitude continuously. The balloon launched successfully. It ascended normally. At around 120,000 feet, telemetry became erratic. GPS showed the balloon's position jumping impossibly. Cameras recorded distorted images as if passing through some kind of interference. Then, at approximately 130,000 feet, all systems failed simultaneously. No gradual degradation, instant loss of signal. The balloon was never recovered. GPS last position showed it at altitude, but search efforts found nothing. The amateur group concluded equipment failure, but they couldn't explain why all systems failed at once, or why GPS showed impossible position jumps before failure, or why the balloon vanished so completely. Firmament researchers catalogue this as the balloon hitting the barrier. They claim the altitude, around 130,000 feet, is consistent with other incidents. They suggest this is where the firmament begins, where the enclosed system transitions to whatever lies beyond. But balloons fail. Electronics malfunction. GPS can give false readings. The simplest explanation is technical failure plus bad luck in recovery. Except the pattern exists across multiple incidents. Different groups, different equipment, similar altitudes, similar failures. Is that statistically significant? Or is it confirmation bias, selectively remembering failures that fit the theory while ignoring the hundreds of successful high-altitude balloon flights that encountered no anomalies? I didn't know. I couldn't know without comprehensive data on all high-altitude balloon flights, their failure rates, the specific altitudes where failures occur, the types of failures experienced. That data might exist somewhere, but I didn't have access to it, and without it, I was left with anecdotes, patterns that might be real or might be imagined. This is the frustration of investigating the firmament theory. The evidence is always almost compelling but never quite definitive, suggestive but not conclusive, enough to maintain curiosity but not enough to force conviction. The cracks in the sky, if they exist, are subtle, not gaping holes that prove the barrier but hints, glimpses, moments when the ordinary seems slightly wrong in ways that resist easy explanation. Firmament researchers call this the veil effect. The truth is not hidden perfectly. It shows through occasionally, but it shows through ambiguously, in ways that can always be explained away by those committed to the conventional model. If you believe in the firmament, these anomalies confirm it. If you believe in infinite space, these anomalies are explained away. The data doesn't force a conclusion. It allows interpretation. And interpretation, I was realizing, is everything. The same observations that convince one person leave another unmoved. Not because one is smart and the other stupid, but because they start from different assumptions about what's possible. The firmament theory doesn't need smoking gun evidence. It needs accumulated anomalies, unexplained phenomena, gaps in official explanation. It thrives on uncertainty, on the recognition that we know less than we pretend to know. And in a world built on claimed certainty, admitting uncertainty is radical. Chapter 10. The unanswered question. By the time I reached this point in my research, I realized the firmament theory is not something you prove or disprove in a conventional sense. It's a framework, a lens, a way of interpreting the same data everyone else has access to but arriving at different conclusions. The question is not whether the sky is solid. The question is, how would we know if it was? If we live inside a closed system, if the sky is a boundary we cannot cross, then every piece of evidence we encounter would be interpreted through a model that assumes the opposite. We would see launches, orbits, satellites, space stations, and we would assume they prove infinite space because that's the only framework we've been given. But what if the framework is wrong? What if everything we observe is real but explained incorrectly? I thought about how science progresses. The standard story is that new evidence forces new theories. We observe something that doesn't fit the current model, so we develop a better model. Truth emerges through accumulation of knowledge. But that's not quite accurate. Science changes through paradigm shifts. An old framework is replaced not when evidence disproves it, but when a new framework explains the same evidence more effectively. The classic example is the transition from Newtonian physics to relativity. Newton's laws worked perfectly for everyday phenomena. They still do. Engineers use Newtonian mechanics for most calculations, but Einstein showed that at extreme velocities and gravitational fields, Newton's laws were approximations, not absolute truths. Einstein didn't prove Newton wrong. He showed that Newton's framework was incomplete, useful within certain limits but inadequate for the full range of physical phenomena. Could the same be true for cosmology? Could the infinite space model be useful, predictive, effective for certain purposes, but fundamentally incomplete? Firmament theorists believe so. They argue that the heliocentric infinite universe model works because it's internally consistent, not because it's true. You can make accurate predictions, build working technology, navigate successfully, all while operating within a flawed framework. Because frameworks don't have to be true to be useful. Ptolemy's geocentric model was useful for over 1,000 years. It made accurate predictions. It allowed navigation, calendar keeping, astronomical observation. The fact that it was based on Earth being the centre didn't prevent it from functioning. Copernicus's heliocentric model was simpler, but it wasn't immediately more accurate. Early heliocentric calculations were often less precise than Ptolemaic ones. The model won not because it was proven true, but because, over time, it proved more adaptable, more elegant, more compatible with emerging physics. Now we have Einstein's relativity, which tells us that there is no absolute frame of reference. Motion is relative to the observer. You can describe the universe from a geocentric perspective or a heliocentric perspective, and both are mathematically valid. This is mind-bending. It means that, in a sense, the ancient geocentric model was not wrong. It was one valid description among many. Firmament theorists seize on this. If motion is relative, if there's no absolute frame of reference, then claiming Earth orbits the Sun is no more true than claiming the Sun orbits Earth. Both are valid perspectives. Both can be used to calculate planetary positions. The choice between them is not empirical, it's practical. We choose the heliocentric model because it makes the math simpler, not because it's objectively true, and if that choice is practical rather than true, then other choices are possible, other frameworks, other cosmologies. The firmament model is one such alternative. It takes the same observations, planetary motion, the appearance of the sky, the behaviour of light and gravity, and interprets them through a framework of enclosed Earth rather than infinite space. Does it work as well as the standard model? For some purposes, yes. For others, no. It requires different mathematics, different assumptions, different explanations for various phenomena. But so did heliocentrism when it first challenged geocentrism. So did relativity when it challenged Newton. New frameworks are always awkward at first. They must be developed, refined, tested against accumulated observations. The firmament model has not undergone that rigorous development. It exists mostly at the margins, among independent researchers without institutional support. It has no funding, no laboratories, no peer review process. Is that because it's wrong, or because it's unacceptable? I started to wonder, what would it take to actually test the firmament hypothesis rigorously? You would need independent access to high altitudes, the ability to launch your own rockets or balloons equipped with instruments designed to detect boundaries rather than assuming infinite space. You would need access to raw satellite data, unprocessed, with full metadata. The ability to verify that images from space are what they claim to be rather than composites or reconstructions. You would need permission to explore Antarctica independently, without restrictions, to circumnavigate it in ways that would definitively confirm or deny its shape. You would need the ability to repeat historical experiments like measuring Earth's curvature or testing for rotation with modern equipment transparently. with results that can't be dismissed as error or misinterpretation. All of this is theoretically possible, but practically, nearly impossible without institutional backing, and institutions are committed to the current model. They have no incentive to test alternatives that threaten foundational assumptions. This is the epistemological trap. The people with resources to test the firmament hypothesis rigorously are the same people who would lose credibility if it were proven true. The people motivated to test it lack the resources, so the hypothesis remains untested, not disproven but not verified, existing in a liminal space between rejected idea and genuine alternative. Firmament theorists argue this is intentional. The system protects itself not through active suppression, but through structural barriers. Make independent verification prohibitively expensive, restrict access to necessary locations, classify alternative frameworks as fringe before they can be seriously examined. Is this conspiracy, or is it simply how institutions function? They conserve what works, they resist change, they defend their paradigms not from malice but from investment, intellectual, professional, financial. Thomas Kuhn called this normal science. The day-to-day work of science happens within accepted paradigms. Revolutionary challenges to those paradigms are rare and resisted until the accumulated anomalies become overwhelming. Have the anomalies around cosmology become overwhelming? Firmament theorists believe so. They point to dark matter and dark energy, mysterious substances invented to make observations fit the model. They point to the cosmological constant problem, the horizon problem, the flatness problem, fundamental questions in cosmology that remain unanswered. They argue that maybe these aren't problems with the details, but problems with the foundation. Maybe the model itself is wrong, and no amount of adjustment will make it right. But mainstream cosmology responds. These are puzzles, not failures. Science always has unsolved problems. That doesn't mean the framework is wrong, just incomplete. Who's right? I couldn't say. Both arguments have merit. Science is always incomplete, but sometimes incompleteness indicates deeper error. What struck me most was the realization that I couldn't decide through pure reason. The question is too large, too foundational. It touches on epistemology, metaphysics, the nature of knowledge itself. How do we know what we know? Through observation, through authority, through institutional consensus, through personal verification. Each method has strengths and weaknesses. Each can lead us astray. And when they conflict, when observation seems to contradict authority, when personal investigation challenges consensus, we must choose which to trust. That choice reveals our values, what we believe about truth, knowledge, power, and trust. The firmament theory asks us to distrust authority, to question consensus, to privilege direct observation over expert interpretation. This is appealing to people who feel betrayed by institutions. It's threatening to people who depend on those institutions for meaning and structure. But it's not simply right or wrong. It's a different epistemological stance, with different risks and different rewards. Trust authority. You might be deceived, but you benefit from accumulated knowledge. Distrust authority. You might discover hidden truth, but you might fall into paranoid delusion. Both paths are dangerous. Both require wisdom to navigate. I don't have that wisdom. I'm still learning. Still trying to figure out how to evaluate claims that exceed my ability to verify directly. The firmament theory taught me this much. I know less than I thought I knew. The confidence I had in modern cosmology was not based on personal investigation, but on trust. And trust, while necessary, is not knowledge. Maybe the sky is solid. Maybe it's infinite void. Maybe the truth is something neither model captures. But the question matters. Not because answering it will change how I live. I'll still wake up, work, eat, sleep regardless of the sky's nature. But because asking it reveals the limits of my knowledge and the structure of my beliefs. And those limits, those structures, are worth examining whether the firmament exists or not. The exercise of questioning fundamental assumptions has value. It makes me more careful about certainty, more aware of how much I accept on faith, more humble about the difference between what I know and what I've been taught. And maybe that's the real purpose of the firmament theory. Not to prove the sky is solid, but to prove that we're still capable of asking. The resistance to that question, the immediate dismissal, the reflex that says this is too absurd to consider. That resistance might be the most interesting data of all. Because if the sky is solid, if we live in a contained world, then the system would not need to hide it perfectly. It would only need to make the idea of questioning it feel absurd, and it has succeeded. Epilogue. Living under a ceiling. I looked up at the night sky after finishing my research. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm, infinite, open. The stars were bright. The moon hung low on the horizon. The key darkness stretched on forever, or seemed to. I didn't know if the firmament was real. I still don't. But I understood why the theory persists. Why it attracts people who are not fools, not uneducated, not detached from reality. It persists because it asks a question that should not matter but does. What if the most fundamental assumption of modern cosmology is wrong? If the sky was never meant to open? If we live inside something rather than on something? If the boundary above us is real but invisible? Then the greatest illusion would be believing it already disappeared. And perhaps that's the point. Not to prove the firmament exists, but to prove that we are still allowed to ask. I turned away from the sky and went inside. The stars remained where they were, fixed or distant, solid or infinite. I would never know for certain, but I would keep looking, because some questions once asked cannot be unasked, and maybe that's exactly what they're afraid of.